I was laying my grandson's passport beside the Sunday bulletin so I would remember to tuck both into his school folder when I noticed the blanket was already open to the stitched corner. I had not unfolded it yet. The blue thread with Owen's birth date was staring up at me from the kitchen table as if the house had turned it there by itself, and for one cold second, with the smell of reheated ham and dish soap still hanging in the room after church, I stood in my own home and felt something inside it go wrong. There are details that do not belong to fear until the moment they do. A dish towel folded the wrong way, a chair left half an inch out from the table, a date where it should not be. By the time I reached for the blanket, I already had the unpleasant, unmistakable sensation that the house had answered a question no one had asked aloud yet. Sunday had begun. The way most Sundays began, now that Evelyn was gone, with stillness. I had learned to dress up as peace. I am 71 years old, and I have lived in the same white brick house on Hollow Creek Road for 40 years, 28 of them with my wife and the last 3 without her. The house sits a little back from the road behind 2 sugar maples and a half-circle drive. That was my idea, and Evelyn's long-running complaint, because she said any man willing to shovel that much gravel in January was either optimistic or vain. The shutters need painting again. The porch light sticks if the humidity is up. The floor in the breakfast nook gives a soft old complaint beneath a man's heel if he steps too hard by the built-in bench. None of that has changed. What changes after a wife dies is the meaning of ordinary things. A house stops being a place where life is happening and becomes a place where life has already happened, and every room asks you whether you are equal to carrying it. I still woke before 6. I still shaved before church, even when no one but the people in the third pew from the back would notice. I still ironed my shirt on Saturday nights, because Evelyn liked a man to look as if he had chosen to appear in the world, rather than been dragged into it. Those routines kept me upright. Not happy, not healed, just upright. That morning I had made coffee in the old percolator because the drip machine Evelyn bought in one of her late attempts to modernize me had finally given up 2 weeks ago with a smell like burnt dust and bad wiring. The percolator made a deeper, more patient sound, the kind of kitchen sound I trusted. I had fried 2 pieces of scrapple for myself, even though the doctor would rather I not eaten them standing at the stove, and watched a thin October light move through the lace curtain above the sink. The weather had turned just enough that the house held the nights cool along the baseboards. I could feel it through my socks when I crossed from the stove to the pantry. Rachel and Daniel and Owen had met me at church the way they usually did on Sundays. Rachel sang in a clear mezzo that sounded enough like Evelyn in certain hymns to hurt if I let it. Daniel shook hands too firmly with the men from the finance committee and held the door for old ladies in a way that made them bless him every week. Owen leaned against my side during the second prayer and traced the grain in the pew rail with one finger the way he always did when the sermon ran long. He was 8 years old, all wrists and cowlicks and sudden hard questions, and I loved him with a softness that sometimes frightened me. There are men who become harder with age because life teaches them the cost of tenderness. I had become, to my surprise, softer. Maybe because once you have buried the love of your life, you no longer have much use for pretending your heart is made of anything stronger than flesh. After church, they came back to my place for lunch. That had been the pattern since Evelyn's funeral, though it had gathered a new shape over time. At first, Rachel came because she thought I should not eat alone. Then she came because Owen liked the house and Daniel liked a predictable Sunday meal. Then it became one of those family customs that arrive without formal agreement and are suddenly there as if they had always been there. I told myself I was grateful for it, and I was. But gratitude and need are cousins that can look too much alike in a widower if he is not careful. I had the ham warming in a low oven and a scalloped potato casserole on the stove covered with the lid from Evelyn's big yellow Dutch oven because I could not find the proper foil pan cover. The kitchen smelled of onion-browned butter and the faint, sweet after scent of the lemon oil I had used on the table the night before. The table itself was oval oak scarred in 3 places from years of plates, school projects, and one unfortunate attempt by Rachel at age 13 to carve her initials with a paring knife. Evelyn had made her sand it smooth and finished the whole top again under supervision. If you mark the family table, she had told her, you do not leave the mark halfway. That was Evelyn, warm but never vague. She believed mercy should be exact. That thought came and went while I set out plates. I did not know yet I would need it. The blanket had been upstairs in the cedar chest since late spring. Owen had asked about it the week before because his class was doing a family heritage board, and Rachel had said she might borrow a few baby pictures and maybe the baptism blanket if I did not mind. I had said of course not. It pleased me to imagine some piece of Evelyn still making its way into the world, stitched neatly into cloth. She had made the blanket the month Owen was born, working it on and off in the breakfast nook, with her sewing basket by her feet and her glasses sliding down her nose every time she looked over the frame to ask me where I had put the good fabric scissors. Cream flannel lined with blue cotton hand-stitched cross at one corner, Owen Matthew in one line, and the date beneath in her careful slanted hand. I had watched her do it, or I thought I had. By the time lunch dishes were mostly cleared, Owen had spread school papers across the hallway floor just beyond the kitchen where the light was good. Rachel sat at the table with a legal pad making one of her tidy lists. Daniel was rinsing plates because he liked to do useful things in small, visible doses, enough to be admired, but not enough to become the man responsible for them. I do not say that unkindly. I liked Daniel mostly. He was steady and steady counted. But there was a difference between men who helped and men who belonged to the work. Evelyn had always known the difference in under a minute. "I need the passport tomorrow," Rachel said without looking up. "Mrs. Brent wants a copy in Owen's folder for the spring travel program packet. They're doing it early this year." I was standing by the sideboard folding my blue-checked dish towel in halves the way Evelyn used to. "It's on the table," I said. I set it out with the bulletin so I wouldn't forget. "Owen." Rachel said gently, "Keep your markers capped if you're near documents, honey." "I know," he said from the floor. The house was full in a way that passed for cheerful. Water ran in the sink. The old refrigerator hummed with that low, persistent motor sound it had made since Bill Haskins repaired it in 1998. A dryer sheet from the laundry room down the hall had drifted into the kitchen and caught under one chair leg. Someone across the creek was leaf-blowing the distant whine, rising and falling through the window glass. The ordinary world had never looked less inclined toward disaster. Then Owen came into the kitchen with the passport open in one hand and the blanket trailing over his arm. At first, I did not register that anything was wrong. He had my wife's blanket and his own face on a government booklet. And both those things belonged in their way to a child trying to understand where he fit in the world. He set them down on the table between Rachel's list and my folded towel. "Grandpa," he said. And I remember exactly how his voice sounded. Not scared, not even troubled, just puzzled in that clean way children still can be before adults teach them puzzle, and danger our cousins too. "Why does this say August?" Rachel looked up. "What?" He pointed with one blunt finger at the passport page, then at the blue stitching in the blanket corner. "My passport says August 19th, but Grandma sewed October 3. Which one is right? No one moved for one beat too long." I wish I could say I knew right then what the silence meant, but that would be dishonest. What I knew was narrower and colder. I knew Rachel moved before the rest of us did. I knew she moved too fast. Her chair legs struck the floor with a hard, backward scrape. Her hand came across the table, not quite snatching and not quite reaching, but somewhere in between, too swift for patience, too practiced for surprise. She touched the passport first. "Oh, honey," she said. And there it was at once, that softness. The voice she used when Owen scraped a knee, or when one of the older ladies at church repeated herself and Rachel wanted everyone to admire how tenderly she handled it. "No, baby, you're mixing things up." That old blanket was stitched during a hard season. Grandma probably made a mistake. The sentence entered the room already finished, too neat, too quick. I looked at the blanket, then at Rachel, then at the passport. I had not yet even read the date for myself, and already she had provided the mercy-colored explanation. Owen pulled his hand back. "But Grandma spelled stuff right." Daniel shut off the water. Hey, bud. Sometimes official things have one date and keepsakes have another because of ceremonies and stuff. Let me see. That made less sense than Rachel's explanation, which was saying something. I reached for the passport, but Rachel's hand got there first. Not enough to wrench it from the boy, not enough to make a scene, but enough that I saw Owen notice it. "Rachel," I said. She looked at me and smiled. Not brightly, carefully. "Dad, it's nothing. He's been all wound up about this project, and I should have explained the blanket earlier. You just said Grandma made a mistake." Well, she let out a soft breath, the kind that implies everyone else should settle with her. "Your mother was under a lot then. That stopped me. Not because of the content, because of the grammar of it. Your mother, not Mom, not Evelyn. Your mother spoken as if she needed distance between herself and the dead woman's hands. Evelyn had been under a lot that season, that was true. Rachel had been living back at home, then exhausted and pale, and trying not to cry in front of people who brought tuna casseroles and banana bread and talked too brightly in our kitchen. The baby had come after a stretch of confusion. I had no appetite now to set down in full because at the time I believed family love meant making room for difficulty without pinning it to the wall. There had been a young man before Daniel, and then there had not been. There had been some legal consultation for a while that Rachel said she did not want to discuss over dinner. There had been nights Evelyn sat in the breakfast nook long after everyone was asleep, stitching or writing things down in her church notebook while I told myself they would sort it all out in God's time. But one thing I knew as surely as I knew my own name was that Evelyn did not embroider dates from fog. She checked bulletins against calendars. She corrected funeral programs when ministers transposed middle initials. Once, on our 25th anniversary, the bakery sent over a cake with 1976 instead of 1977 piped into the corner, and Evelyn made them redo the whole thing because, as she told me in the car on the way home, love deserves accuracy. She was not harsh about it, just exact. I picked up the blanket. The flannel was softer now than when she made it worn by years and washings and one child's sleep. The blue stitching still lay flat and sure in the corner. Owen Matthew. October 3rd. I ran my thumb over the numbers as if they might shift under pressure and tell me I had gone foolish in my old age. "Let me see the passport," I said. Rachel's grip tightened almost invisibly. "Dad." I looked up. "Let me see it." The room changed in one small ugly turn. Daniel did not move closer, but something in him readied itself. Rachel's face held. Owen went very still. Then she laughed a little too lightly. "Of course. I'm just saying we don't need to turn this into a thing in front of him." That sentence landed harder than the first one. In front of him. As if truth itself were indecent company for a child. She slid the passport toward me. I opened it. August 19th stared up from the page beside Owen's school-sober little face. For a moment, my thoughts did not assemble cleanly. I knew only facts. The blanket said October the 3rd. The passport said August 19th. Evelyn had not stitched carelessly. Rachel had explained before I asked, and the child had been taught by instinct, if not by direct order, to grow quiet the second the adults grew soft. Grandpa Owen said. I looked at him. There was a thin place in my chest that had nothing to do with age. "I'm thinking," I said. Rachel touched Owen's shoulder. "Why don't you go wash up, honey? We'll sort out the paperwork." He did not move. "Which birthday do I have?" No one answered him fast enough. That is the shameful truth of it. 4 adults in a warm kitchen, one child asking the simplest question in the world, and not one of us answered fast enough. Rachel knelt beside him then, and her voice became even gentler. "You have the birthday Mommy told you, sweetheart. Sometimes old keepsakes get things wrong. Okay." It was a hard time, and Grandma was doing her best. There was something almost beautiful about how carefully she said it, and that was what made it ugly. I saw it then. Not the whole thing, not even close, but enough to feel the first real chill. Softness can hide a lot if everybody in the room has spent years calling softness holy. Owen looked at the blanket again. Grandma did good sewing. Yes, Rachel said, she did. But people can still make mistakes. He looked at me. I should tell you I did not become heroic in that instant. I did not slam the passport shut and demand answers. I did what I had done too often in my life when faced with a pain that had not yet announced its full shape. I moderated. We'll look at it, I told him. No one's mad. Why don't you wash your hands and we'll have pie after? That was my failure, though I did not know how large it was yet. I offered pie where I should have offered truth. Owen nodded because children will accept almost any shape of uncertainty if the adults package it in a familiar voice. He took the blanket carefully as if it might tear and started toward the downstairs bathroom. No, Rachel said too quickly. Leave the blanket here, honey. You don't want to get it wet. He hesitated, then handed it back. The moment lasted no longer than a breath, but something in me recorded it. Not just what she said, how fast she wanted that blanket back under adult control. Daniel reached for the pie server. Who wants coffee? Not yet, I said. He looked at me. Tom, not yet. My voice was not loud. Maybe that was why it landed. Rachel rose slowly from her crouch. The kitchen seemed suddenly full of edges. The refrigerator motor cut off. Somewhere outside a car door slammed. I put the passport down beside the blanket and laid my palm over both. August 19, I said. That's what this says. Rachel crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. Dad, please. No, not please. I'm asking a straight question. It was corrected later. Daniel glanced at her. She must have felt it because she added quickly, administratively. There was confusion when he was first born. Confusion with what? With dates. Dates, I repeated. She exhaled through her nose. He came early. It was all chaotic. You remember how it was? I remembered some of it. Not that. He came early from what her eyes flashed, then settled. This is exactly why I didn't want to do this in front of Owen. He's in the bathroom. That is not the point. It is the point if you keep using him to stop a question. The words came out before I had time to smooth them. Rachel went still in a way I had seen only twice before in her life. Once when she was 16, and Evelyn found cigarettes in her winter coat, and once at the cemetery after the funeral, when a woman from church called Evelyn at peace too soon, and Rachel looked ready to strike her for it. Daniel stepped in, not physically, but with tone. Tom, nobody is hiding anything. Let's just get the right paperwork together and keep this from becoming a whole family drama over a school packet. There are sentences a man can forgive, and sentences that tell him where he stands. Whole family drama was one of the second kind. It placed me outside a reason before I had done anything but ask which date belonged to my grandson. I looked back at the blanket. October 3rd, blue thread, tight corners, Evelyn's hand all over it. And that was when the memory came, not invited, not gentle. It was night, rain on the kitchen windows. Rachel upstairs crying because the baby would not settle, and she had not slept more than 40 minutes at a time in days. Evelyn in the breakfast nook lamplight with the blanket spread across her lap. Head-bent needle flashing in and out of cloth. I had stood in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea and said, "You can finish the date tomorrow. You're too tired." She had not looked up. "No," she said, "not dates." Then she had taken off her glasses, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose, and added quieter, "Children deserve to begin in the truth. Tom, even when the truth is messy." At the time, I thought she meant something tender and general, the sort of good sentence people say when babies come into confused circumstances. Standing there in my kitchen, 3 years after her death, with Rachel's voice softening over a contradiction that should not exist, I understood that memory differently. The charge in the room changed with it. What was the confusion, I asked again. Rachel's mouth tightened. "Dad, honestly, you know how hard that season was. Mom was helping me through a lot. There were medical papers, legal papers, hospital form. Not everything lined up right away. Medical papers don't make a blanket wrong. Her face moved then, not much but enough. A flicker, irritation first, then pity arranged over it like a napkin over a stain. "You are doing that thing," she said quietly. "What thing?" "The thing where grief makes you grab onto one object and treat it like it's sacred proof of something." That hurt because it was almost clever. It took my love for Evelyn and repositioned it as frailty. It made my memory suspect in the name of my mourning. I felt heat rise under my collar. "Your mother made this?" "Yes. During a very hard time." "That is what I am saying." "No," I said. "What you are saying is, I should trust your tone more than her hands." For a second, Daniel looked as startled as I felt. Rachel's eyes cooled. The bathroom door opened. Owen came back in, hands damp hair combed by his own fingers. Nobody spoke. He looked from one face to another and understood, as children do, that the air had gone wrong. "I can do the pie later," he said. Rachel smiled at him with such tenderness it made my stomach hurt. "Go get your markers and keep working on your poster, sweetheart. Grandpa and I are just having grown-up talk." "About me?" "No," Daniel said too fast this time. "Just paperwork." Owen nodded, but he did not look convinced. He gathered his things from the hall and went toward the den instead of back to the floor by the kitchen, which meant he wanted distance without wanting to seem as if he did. That too, I noticed. When he was gone, Rachel lowered her voice. "Dad, I'm asking you not to spiral on this. The school just needs a copy. I'll handle it. I'm sure you will." She heard what was in it. Something like weariness crossed her face. Real weariness, maybe. That was part of what made the whole thing so difficult even then. Rachel was not a monster. She was my daughter. I had held her feverish at 4 years old while Evelyn ran a cool cloth over her neck. I had taught her to ride a bike in this very driveway. I had seen her survive humiliations. I would have gladly taken onto my own body if God had offered the trade. If there had been malice in her plain and ugly, I might have known what to do, but what was in Rachel looked like care. That was the danger. "I am not spiraling," I said. "I am asking why my grandson's passport says August and your mother stitched October." She closed her eyes briefly. "Because I changed the official date later." The room went quiet enough to hear the old baseboard click. Daniel stared at her. "Rachel?" She ignored him. Not the birth date exactly, the recorded usage date. For school travel consistency, it was complicated. That sentence was so slippery I almost missed its shape. Recorded usage date. "It is not as bizarre as you're making it sound." "Then make it sound plain." She rubbed the inside of her wrist with her thumb. I had seen that motion all her life when she was lying calmly or trying not to scream. "I am not doing this like a deposition in your kitchen." I looked down at the passport again, then at the blanket, then toward the den where Owen's markers had begun their soft roll and stop on the hardwood floorboards. My kitchen, my grandson, my wife stitching, and my daughter talking about a recorded usage date as if identity were a casserole recipe a woman could revise once she had found a cleaner version. Daniel cleared his throat. "Tom, maybe we all take a breath." I turned to him. "Did you know?" His silence was not long. It did not have to be. "I knew there were complications," he said. "That is not what I asked." He shifted his weight, adjusted his watch band. "I knew the paperwork had been standardized." "Standardized?" I repeated. Rachel's chin lifted a fraction. "You are deliberately making this sound sinister." "No," I said. "I think maybe I'm hearing it for the first time without everyone else's softening around it." Her eyes flashed again. Mom understood. That landed where she meant it to. If Evelyn understood, then my resistance could be framed as grief confusion or male failure to appreciate complexity. For one disorienting second, it almost worked. Then I remembered Evelyn in the breakfast nook saying, "Not dates." The smell of ham had thickened in the oven. Too warm now, a little sweet at the edges where the glaze had gone past right. I crossed to the stove and shut it off because I needed to move, or else I might have said something reckless. Behind me, Rachel went on gentler again because she thought gentleness always improved her position. "Dad, we were trying to give Owen a cleaner start. That is all. The legalities were messy and Daniel was stepping in and everything was cleaner than what?" She did not answer. I turned. "Cleaner than what, Rachel?" Her face changed. Not crumpling, hardening under softness. "Cleaner than chaos," she said. "Cleaner than gossip. Cleaner than a timeline he does not need to carry around, like some burden for the rest of his life." A bird hit the window outside with a soft, abrupt thump and flew off. No one flinched, maybe because we had already used up our flinching. "That timeline," I said carefully, "is his life." She folded her arms again. "He is 8. So he gets a false beginning, he gets peace." There it was. For a moment I could not speak. I thought of Evelyn in that rain-lit room. Children deserve to begin in the truth, Tom, even when the truth is messy. I looked at Rachel and saw for the first time that day not just my daughter's distress, but the outline of a system. Peace, hard season, don't confuse him. Mom understood. Paperwork, standardized, all of it soft, all of it shaped to make a straight question sound cruel. And I, God help me, had been susceptible to that shape all my life. Owen appeared again in the doorway, red marker in hand. "Can I put both birthdays on the poster?" Rachel actually closed her eyes. "No," she said. "There is only one birthday." He nodded once. "Which one?" Nobody answered fast enough a second time. He looked at me then, and if I live to be 90, I will not forget the expression in his face. It was not fear yet. It was something older and sadder, the beginning of self-doubt. The beginning of a child wondering whether the adults around him might ask him to distrust what is in front of him so they can stay comfortable. "Go on in the den, buddy," I said softly. He did. Rachel pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and let out one careful breath. Not crying, arranging herself. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. I looked at the blanket one more time. Then at the passport. I closed the passport and slid it toward her. She reached for it at once. But I kept the blanket. "Take your paperwork," I said. "Dad, take your paperwork." Something in my voice must have warned her this time because she took the passport without argument. Daniel stood very still. The den was quiet now. Even the markers had stopped rolling. Rachel tucked the passport into her bag with controlled movements. "I am not fighting with you in front of my son. That would be a new experience for both of us," I said. Her head snapped up, hurt flashing cleanly across her face before she smothered it. "That hurt me too. I want that understood. Truth's not a blade a decent man enjoys drawing even when it belongs in his hand." She slung her bag over her shoulder. "Come on, Owen." He came to the doorway but did not cross it. "Can I take Grandma's blanket?" "No," Rachel said. I answered at the same time. "Not today." She looked at me sharply. I met it. Daniel picked up the pie server and set it down again because he could not seem to think where it belonged anymore. "Maybe we call later," he said to no one in particular. Rachel took Owen. His coat from the peg by the mudroom and helped him into it with all the tenderness of a mother leaving an uncomfortable doctor's office. He glanced back once at me, then at the blanket in my hands. When the door closed behind them, the whole house altered. Not because silence fell. Silence had lived with me for 3 years. Because the wrong silence fell, the kind that leaves an argument hanging in the room like steam after lids come off. I stood there listening to their car doors, the engine, the soft crunch of gravel. The refrigerator motor came back on. Somewhere in the den, Owen had forgotten his red plastic Sunday school bookmark on the rug. I could see one corner of it from the kitchen doorway. The blanket felt heavier now than cloth should. I laid it carefully on the table and sat down. The place setting Rachel had used still held the crescent smear of mustard where her fork had rested. Daniel's coffee cup stood by the sink, half an inch of cold coffee in the bottom. I stared at both until their ordinariness became grotesque. How could a room look so normal with that kind of sentence still in it, "He gets peace"? Peace. That word had a smell now. Ham glaze gone too sweet. Wet dish towel, lemon oil. It smelled like something turning. I sat there longer than I mean to admit. Long enough for the light to change on the table. Long enough for my knees to stiffen. I picked up the blanket again and studied the stitching. Evelyn's hand was everywhere. The little hitch where her thread tension always tightened on the number 2. The exact angle of the crossbar in the October tea because she wrote in cloth the same way she wrote on paper. If I had been less familiar with her, I might have needed convincing. I was too familiar to doubt. Not dates. The memory hurt differently now. Not tenderly. Like a correction arriving late. I rose and carried the blanket to the breakfast nook. Evelyn's sewing basket still sat under the bench where I had left it after sorting some of her things the first winter without her, and then losing the nerve to go farther. The basket was oval-woven reed, one handle repaired twice with blue grosgrain ribbon because she said perfectly good things ought not be discarded for one weakness. I set the blanket on the bench and knelt with more noise than dignity to pull the basket out. Inside were thread cards, 2 thimbles, a pincushion shaped like a tomato. Spare reading glasses with 1 temple arm, held by tape, and 3 folded pieces of fabric. The blue cotton matched the backing of Owen's blanket exactly. I touched it, and had all at once the terrible sense of kneeling in the outline of my wife's absence. Her work basket, her room in the house, her exact hands. And me 3 years too late trying to understand what she had been protecting when I should perhaps have asked sooner. Beneath the fabric lay a small notepad torn from the church office supply stack years ago. On the top page in her handwriting she had written measurements for blanket binding, and then below that meal return, Linda Tuesday / Bev Thursday / Casky Dish Keep Lid. No birth date, no revelation, only Evelyn doing what she always did, keeping the world from slipping out of order. I shut my eyes. When I opened them, I looked toward the pantry. The thought came without drama, not a grand deduction, just a narrow domestic instinct. Meal return. Casky dish, keep lid. Rachel had said it was a hard season, chaotic, confusing paperwork and all the rest. Fine. But chaos in our house always left traces because Evelyn labeled everything. Soups, casseroles, produce from the church garden. Emergency frozen meals for new mothers. Condolence cakes, side dishes for surgery families. She dated masking tape with that same blue pen and stacked lids in one of the shallow drawers by the pantry door until their rightful dishes came home. If there had been meals around Owen's birth, Evelyn would have dated them. And if the meals came when I remembered they came, I did not finish the thought. I stood too quickly, hand on the bench for balance, and went to the pantry. The pantry door stuck a little in damp weather, and that day it gave with its usual soft wooden groan. The smell inside was dry cardboard, onion skins, cinnamon, and the faint, cool metal scent of canned goods. Evelyn had kept holiday seasonings on the left, baking things on the upper shelves, and meal return odds on the bottom right, near the freezer, because, as she put it, care work ought not require a map. I had maintained the order, mostly because changing it felt like rubbing out her handwriting. The shallow drawer still held a scatter of old masking tape strips curled from age. A couple loose plastic lids, 2 Sharpies, 3 church recipe cards with soup stains on them. I opened the freezer below, and a wash of cold air hit my face, smelling of frost and old broth. There were newer containers in front, my chili frozen biscuits, a foil pan of pimento cheese grits Linda had dropped off in August after my colonoscopy. Behind them, stacked along the side, were 2 older round casserole lids and 1 rectangular plastic top with brittle tape still stuck to it. My fingers had gone clumsy. I took out the first lid, chicken tetrazzini in Evelyn's hand, no date left visible. The second, return to Bev S. Again, no date. The third was the rectangular top from an old church casserole dish, cloudy with age, the tape yellowed, but still clinging in one corner. I turned it toward the light from the pantry doorway. The blue ink had faded, but not enough. For Rachel, plus baby October 9th, keep covered, /warm, low. I stood there with the freezer cold on my legs and the lid in my hand, and felt the bottom of the story drop away. October 9th. Not August. Not some vague ceremonial memory. Not a grandmother's tired mistake stitched into cloth. A dated meal lid in Evelyn's exact hand, written for Rachel and baby, 6 days after the date on the blanket and 7 full weeks after the date on the passport. Behind me, the house was silent. In front of me, the pantry shelves held their rows like witnesses. And in my hand, light as plastic was the first thing in that house that made the official birthday impossible. I stayed in the pantry a long time with that lid in my hand. The freezer breathed cold against my shins. Somewhere above me in the kitchen, the house gave one of its ordinary settling pops as the afternoon cooled. A car passed on Hollow Creek Road tires, whispering over old patched pavement. All of it went on, sounding like the same house, the same day, the same life, while the thing in my hand rearranged the meaning of the room around me. For Rachel, plus baby. October 9th. There are discoveries that strike like glass breaking, and there are discoveries that move in slow and poisonous because they do not merely tell you something new. They make you revisit everything you already know and ask what kind of man you were while it was happening. I did not have the luxury of sudden certainty. What I had was worse. I had enough. Enough to know the blanket was not a mistake. Enough to know the passport did not fit. Enough to understand that Rachel's softness at my kitchen table had not risen from confusion. It had risen from fear. I shut the freezer with my knee and stood there with the lid until my fingers began to ache from the cold plastic. Then I set it on the pantry shelf. Not because I was done with it, but because I could not bear the thought of dropping it like any other piece of old kitchen junk. It looked indecently ordinary, lying there beside flour and canned green beans. When Evelyn was alive, this pantry had always felt like a room under discipline. Not stiff, not joyless, just truthful. She dated everything, labeled everything. She believed confusion was expensive. Not only in money, though she had grown up with enough uncertainty about bills to distrust sloppiness in all forms. She meant morally expensive. If a dish went to the Collinses after surgery, the tape said Collins. If a pound cake was for the funeral meal, the tape said funeral, and the date it was baked. If Rachel was spending a night at the house after another fight with the man she was seeing, then the pantry would hold extra soup in the front row and an unfrosted cake on the second shelf, because as Evelyn once put it, grief and embarrassment both make people hungry at odd hours. I had loved those habits while not fully understanding them. That was beginning to shame me. I took the lid and the blanket back to the kitchen and laid them side by side on the table. The sunlight had shifted lower and turned the scratched places in the oak top pale. October 9th sat near October 3rd like two witnesses who had not spoken to one another in years and suddenly recognized the same crime. I sank into the chair at the head of the table where Evelyn used to tell me not to hunch because I looked like a man expecting bad news. The smell of ham had gone past pleasant now into that sticky sweet heaviness food gets when it has waited too long for people to eat it. I should have put everything away. I should have washed the plates in the sink. Instead, I sat with my palms flat on the table and looked at the blanket until the stitches blurred. What exactly had Rachel said? A hard season. Medical papers, legal papers, hospital forms. The official date was changed later. He gets peace. I had spent most of my life listening for the pain inside what people said. That had been the shape of my decency, I suppose. My wife used to say I was a man who could hear the bruise before he heard the lie. She meant it kindly, At the moment, it did not feel kind at all, because I could hear Rachel's pain in every one of those sentences. I could hear how badly she wanted the world to hold still around the cleaner version. What I had failed to hear until far too late was the lie that pain had wrapped itself around. I picked up the blanket again. The stitching no longer felt only tender. It felt stubborn, almost defiant. I could see Evelyn in it now, not simply making something lovely for a child, but fixing a date into cloth, because cloth stayed when people got soft. That thought brought her back so sharply I almost turned my head, expecting to find her at the counter. There had been a Tuesday night that first week after Owen came home when rain blew against the kitchen windows so hard it rattled the old storm panes. Rachel was upstairs crying quietly because she hated crying loudly in front of anyone. The baby had just finally fallen asleep in the old cradle Daniel later called that antique death trap before we gave it away, though it had held both Rachel and our son Michael and half the babies in our church at one point or another. I had come into the kitchen and found Evelyn at the counter with 3 casserole lids lined up in a row and a legal pad open beside her. She was writing names, dates, and times in that small exact hand. I remember saying, "You don't have to make an inventory of supper." She did not smile. "I'm not inventorying supper." "What then?" Who came when? Who stayed? Who said what they could do and what they actually did? I had laughed a little because I thought she was overtired. Evelyn. That was when she looked at me, not angry, not even impatient, just tired in a way I did not like because it suggested there were weights in the room I was not carrying. "Tom," she said, "when people are hurting, details go soft. Somebody has to keep them from disappearing." At the time, I heard a woman managing church logistics. Sitting in my kitchen 3 years after her funeral, with that casserole lid beside her grandson's blanket, I heard something else. Not prophecy, nothing dramatic, something sadder. A wife doing the moral clerical work the rest of us preferred not to notice. I got up too fast and nearly knocked my chair back. The movement seemed to break whatever spell had kept me sitting there. I needed more than one lid and one memory. I needed something that lived outside my own head. I put the ham away, wrapped the potatoes, rinsed plates. The work steadied me enough to think in straight lines. The passport said August, the blanket said October, the freezer lid said Rachel plus baby on October 9th. Rachel had claimed chaos paperwork hard season. Daniel had said standardized. If I wanted to know whether I was standing near confusion or something uglier, I needed to follow the path Evelyn would have followed: objects, dates, sequence. That meant the house first. By 5 o'clock, the light had gone amber in the front rooms. I carried the blanket upstairs and into my bedroom, then stopped in the doorway because I could not bring myself to put it back into the cedar chest. It would have felt too much like hiding it. Instead, I laid it across the foot of the bed on the quilt Evelyn's aunt had pieced in 1964. Her room slippers still sat in the closet where I could see them if the door was open. Her side of the dresser held nothing on top anymore except the little milk glass dish where she used to drop her wedding ring before lotioning her hands at night. Even cleaned out, that side of the room remained hers in a way I could not disturb. The blanket against the quilt looked less like a keepsake than a statement. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember the baby dedication. We had not baptized infants in our church. We dedicated them, held them up in front of the congregation, prayed over the family, asked if the church would help guide the child into faith and decency. It had been one of the first Sundays Rachel came back fully into public after those hard months. I remembered she wore a pale green dress because Evelyn insisted color would be kinder to her than black or navy. I remembered Daniel stood beside her. Or had he? No, that was wrong. I paused there, my hands on my knees, and felt the first deeper tremor. Daniel had been around by then, hadn't he? I could picture him in my mind now because Daniel, once he entered a scene, had a way of settling himself into it so neatly that the earlier shape of things blurred. He held doors, carried casserole dishes, loaded folding chairs after youth events. He made himself useful in the kind of ways communities admire because they do not cost much emotionally and look good from 10 feet away. But on the dedication day itself, was he there? Or had he come later? After people began using phrases like stable and thank the Lord, and finally, I could not tell. That frightened me more than I wanted to admit. Not because I thought my memory was failing in some medical sense, because it showed me how easily a man can let later order settle over earlier disorder until he mistakes one for the other. I looked again at the blanket. October 3rd. If Owen was born, then the dedication would have fallen later than I had been made to believe. I stood and went back downstairs. The hall closet by the mudroom was where we kept the church overflow. No one ever properly assigned a home to serving platters, photo boards, extra aluminum carriers, floral arrangement urns after funerals, and the kind of shallow cardboard archive boxes church women have always understood better than men. The closet smelled faintly of old paper cardboard and the lavender sachet Evelyn kept hanging from the top shelf to discourage mustiness. I switched on the overhead bulb, the weak yellow one I kept meaning to replace, and began pulling boxes down. The first held Christmas pageant costumes from years ago. The second picture frames with the glass wrapped in newspaper. The third, labeled Fellowship Board / Baby Dedication / Miscellaneous, gave me a little jolt before I had even opened it. Inside were foam core boards with old photos mounted in careful rows. Some had little label cards tucked under corners. Some labels were missing, leaving lighter rectangular shadows against the board where tape had once been. I slid one free and set it on the mudroom bench under the light. There was Owen red-faced and furious in one picture wrapped in the same blanket. Rachel looking drawn but smiling. Evelyn, younger than I wanted to see her now, one hand at Rachel's back. Linda Caskey in the background carrying what looked like a foil pan with 2 oven mitts. Another photo showed the church foyer decorated for baby dedication, Sunday white chrysanthemums, blue ribbon, a small signboard that should have had the date in one corner. I leaned closer. The date had been removed. Not ripped, peeled cleanly, leaving the pale adhesive shadow of a rectangle no bigger than a business card. I told myself not to overread that. Boards were reused, labels came off, things got repurposed. Then I found a small stack of loose printed caption cards rubber-banded together in the side of the box. Owen Hale Baby Dedication. Sunday. The Hale family. A beautiful beginning. No date. I went through the whole stack. No date on any of the later cards. But on one card near the bottom, bent at one corner and stuck to another with old tape, I found what looked like an earlier version in Rachel's handwriting. Owen Matthew Dedication, Sunday, November 17th. The year line had been crossed out so heavily it nearly tore the card. Across the top in a different pen, someone had written, "Print New." I sat back on my heels on the mudroom floor and stared at it. November 17th. Not proof yet. But it sat in my gut the way proof sits when it is still one room away. If Owen had been born October the 3rd, a November dedication made sense. If he had been born August 19th, it made less sense, not impossible, but strange enough, that I would have remembered the church waiting 3 full months to dedicate the baby. Our church did not run like that. We folded people in fast. It was part of our pride and part of our trouble. We were good at making a room around wounded people before anyone had decided what truth belonged inside it. The light in the closet buzzed faintly overhead. I set the card aside and kept looking. The box yielded more of the same loose push pins, a roll of double-sided tape, 2 old paper programs, and a manila envelope with Evelyn's handwriting on the front. Rachel /meal return /keep till settled. I had to sit down on the bench. The handwriting on the envelope was calm. That made it worse. Calm handwriting on dangerous things always does. Inside were recipe cards, all in church lady script. Tuna bake from Bev, chicken divan from Linda, vegetable soup from June Talmadge, and tucked among them 3 narrow slips torn from legal pad paper. Evelyn's hand again. Return Bev dish Thursday. Linda lid in freezer. Check dedication with Velma. Check dedication with Velma. My mouth went dry. There was nothing dramatic in those words. No accusation, no alarm, only Evelyn doing what she did, tying domestic pieces to institutional ones. But the phrase changed the temperature of my bones. Because I knew what it meant. She had not simply been feeding Rachel through a hard season. She had been keeping chronology, matching dishes to dates, matching dates to church records. Not because she was quirky or controlling or over-organized, because something about the season had already taught her that softness was swallowing facts. And I had missed it. I put the slips back into the envelope with care that bordered on reverence. Then I carried the whole box into the kitchen and laid the pieces out on the table the way a poorer man might lay out jewelry after discovering what was inside his own walls. The house had begun to feel wrong in increments. Not haunted, not theatrical, worse than that. It felt curated, as if every warm object in it had been capable for years of carrying two meanings at once, the one love gave it and the one fear needed from it. By then it was nearly dark. I turned on the lamp over the sink and the small one on the sideboard because the overhead fixture made everything look too naked when I was troubled. I brewed fresh coffee even though it was past the hour I ought to drink it. The percolator clicked and murmured. I stood with both hands braced on the counter and tried to decide whether I was already beyond suspicion and into certainty. I was not. That was the misery of it. I had enough to know something had been maintained. I did not yet know how many people had helped maintain it, or why, or whether the lie sat only in the birthday or in the shape of the family itself. At 7:30, the phone rang. Rachel. I let it ring twice before answering. Hello. Her voice came in quiet and low. Too low. Is Owen there? No. A pause. He left his red bookmark. It's on the den rug. Can Daniel swing by for it? No. That pause was longer. Dad, you can come get it tomorrow. I would rather not leave this hanging. It's already hanging. The softness in her voice sharpened so slightly another man might not have heard it. I heard it. Can we not do this like strangers? No one is doing anything like strangers. I'm asking for calm. I nearly laughed at that, not because it was funny, because it was the word she always reached for when she wanted control back under a prettier name. I have been calm all day. You know what I mean. I don't. You don't have to make this uglier than it is. There was the whispering quality the whole conversation had been missing. Not intimacy, containment. Her voice dropped as if Owen might hear from the next room. Though I knew from the muted television in the background that she was the one standing apart, maybe in the laundry room or pantry of her own house, making sure no one heard the edges in her. What exactly is it, I asked. Another pause. A decision we made during a vulnerable time. We? Yes. You and Daniel. Yes. Not me. That was not a rejection of you. It sounds a lot like one. The television volume dipped in the background as if someone had muted it. Rachel spoke even lower. Dad, listen to me carefully. Owen does not need to grow up under the weight of things that were unstable before he could speak. He has a father. He has a home. He has a life that makes sense. We protected that. The word protected sat between us like something oily, from what I said. From confusion. From gossip. From a beginning that would invite questions he cannot carry yet. He's carrying them already. Her breath caught softly. Only because the blanket came out. That sentence hollowed me. Only because the blanket came out. As if the object were the problem. As if Evelyn's hands were the danger. I turned and looked at the blanket folded on my table. Your mother stitched the truth into that cloth. She stitched one version of a hard season. No. I kept my voice low because I had discovered something in the last few hours. A man can become more frightening and calm than he ever would, shouting. No, Rachel. She stitched a date. I heard a floorboard creak on her end, then the faint rattle of a vent cover. She was pacing. "You are idealizing her," she whispered. That hurt, and she knew it would. "She made mistakes." "Yes," I said, "but not dates." Rachel said nothing for several seconds. When she spoke again, the softness had gone strangely childlike. "You weren't there the way she was." At first, I thought she meant postpartum nights crying paperwork, all of it. Then I understood the deeper accusation under it. You weren't there inside the moral details. You were not the one carrying the shape of things. Evelyn was. The worst part was that she was not entirely wrong. "What are you asking of me?" I said. "I'm asking you to let this rest tonight, and tomorrow, we can talk tomorrow. When nobody is tired, when Owen isn't listening." That sounds familiar. "Dad," her whisper frayed, "please do not turn me into something I'm not." I closed my eyes. "Then tell me what you are." I heard her inhale, then stop herself. Not because she had no answer, because any straight answer would have cost her too much. Finally, she said, "I'm a mother, and I'm his grandfather. That isn't the same." "No," I said. "It isn't." When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen holding the silent receiver for so long, the dial tone came back in a flat electronic hum. I slept badly, not with dramatic dreams. Worse, with shallow jolts of thought every time I drifted. November 17th, check dedication with Velma, only because the blanket came out. You weren't there the way she was. Each time I woke, the house sat around me full of familiar dark shapes that no longer felt merely familiar. The hallway runner, the laundry room door left ajar, the faint moonlight on the banister Evelyn used to polish with old socks. Every object seemed to be withholding something from me, not because it had changed, but because I had. At 4:30, I gave up and came downstairs. The kitchen at that hour belonged to the dead and the stubborn. Evelyn had always liked it before. Sunrise said a house was truest when no one was performing in it yet. I stood at the counter drinking coffee black and looking at the envelope. The caption card, the casserole lid, and the blanket laid out under the dim lamp. The whole arrangement made my home look as if it had been subpoenaed. I showered, shaved, put on a clean shirt, and by 8:15 I was on my way to the church. The office entrance was around the back by the fellowship hall under a narrow awning where rain always blew in from the west. The church smelled the way churches built in 1958 and updated only halfway ever smell in the morning old carpet, lemon cleaner, brewed coffee from a pot started too early, and the ghost of every casserole ever carried through the fellowship kitchen. I had known that smell longer than I had known some cousins. Velma Pritchard was in the office because Velma was always in the office when something needed remembering properly. She was 78, silver-haired and narrow-shouldered, with a pair of reading glasses on a chain and a gold cross pin on the collar of her cardigan. She looked up from the copy machine with a paper stack in her hand. "Well," she said, "either somebody's dead or you've come to volunteer." "Morning, Velma." That doesn't answer the question. I almost smiled. Then I realized I did not have it in me. Something in my face must have shown because she set the papers down and came around the counter. "Tom, I need to ask you about Owen's dedication." She did not move for a second, just long enough. Then she said, "All right. That alone cost me something. Not because it confirmed guilt, because it meant the question itself belonged to a room where people already knew how to stand." She led me into the tiny archive room off the office. Archive room was generous. It was a windowless square with metal shelves, file drawers, binders, old communion trays in boxes, and one card table under a fluorescent light that hummed like a bad thought. Velma shut the door behind us. "Not all the way, just enough for privacy." "That boy all right?" she asked. "I don't know." She nodded once, then took off her glasses and cleaned them slowly on the hem of her cardigan. "What is it you think you need?" "That's not the question," I said. "No," she said. "It usually isn't." I put the caption card on the table first, then the envelope slip. Then, after 1 second of hesitation that felt like betrayal and necessity, at once the blanket folded to show the date. Velma looked at the stitching and sat down. That cost me too. Not her surprise, her sadness. It is a terrible thing to watch another old person recognize the shape of your trouble before you have named it. Owen's passport says August 19th, I said. This says October 3rd. I found a casserole lid from October 9th marked for Rachel and baby. In Evelyn's hand. I heard my own voice and thought how calm it sounded. A man reciting weather changes. Rachel says there were complications and later standardizing. Velma slid the blanket closer with fingertips that hardly touched the cloth. Evelyn did that work right here in the office a few afternoons, she said quietly. Brought her basket because Rachel wouldn't sleep long enough at home for her to finish anything. I know. She checked the thread color against the nursery ribbon. Velma's thumb smoothed the edge of the blanket once. She wouldn't have put the wrong date on it. I stared at her. There are confirmations a man expects from records and confirmations that break him because they come from another person who knew the hands he loved. That was one of the second kind. Can you show me the dedication registry, I asked. Velma drew in a breath through her nose and let it out. I can show you what we kept. What does that mean? It means. She rose carefully and crossed to a file drawer. There are versions of things sometimes. Official copies, working copies, clean copies for boards, draft notations. She opened a drawer and slid a folder out. And there are times I wish our church had loved clarity as much as it loved mercy. My mouth went dry again. She returned to the table and laid the folder down. Inside were baptism and dedication records, sorted by year-typed copies, clipped to handwritten forms. Velma's finger moved down a page until it stopped. Owen Matthew Hale. Parents, Rachel Mercer and Daniel Hale. Dedication date, November the 17th. My eyes went first to the date, then to the parent line, then back to the date. November 17th. The same number Rachel had crossed out on the old card to print clean later. I could hear the fluorescent hum. This is the registry copy, I said. This is the clean office copy. Clean. Velma looked at me over her glasses. Tom. No, don't Tom me yet. She let that pass. Why? November 17th. Because that's when the dedication was. If he was born August 19th, why wait? She said nothing. Velma. She folded her hands. Because he wasn't born August 19th. The room did not move. I did. I gripped the edge of the card table hard enough to feel the metal lip under my fingers. She opened another inner sleeve from the folder. This one held a smaller handwritten note attached to the typed form with a rusting paperclip. Evelyn's handwriting was not on it. Velma's was. Birth, October 3rd. Dead. Delayed until family settled. See meal support notes. I had to read it twice because my eyes kept trying to rearrange it into something milder. Birth, October 3rd. I sat down without meaning to. Velma's voice came from a short distance away, careful, almost formal now. I kept that notation because Evelyn asked me not to let the original date disappear. I looked up. She didn't make a scene, Velma said. She didn't accuse anybody, but she came in with that blanket folded over her arm and said, Velma, I know people are trying to get Rachel through this with dignity, and I appreciate that, but the record must remain true somewhere. I stared at the little note until the handwriting doubled. My wife had come here, said those words, carried the blanket like testimony, and I had not known. The cost of that landed slowly then all at once. Not only that Evelyn had seen farther than I did, that she had acted where I had soothed, that while I was thanking God for how the church was surrounding our daughter, my wife was quietly making sure surrounding did not become erasing. I said very quietly, Why didn't you tell me Velma did not defend herself? She looked tired. At first, because it did not seem like mine to tell. Then because years passed. Then because I am old enough to know the things we delay out of courtesy do not become easier to say. A church secretary's answer. Honest and inadequate all at once, which made it hard to hate. Did Rachel ask you to change it? Rachel asked for cleaner copies for school binders and photo boards later on. She said the old season had been unstable and the family had chosen a more consistent administrative line. Velma's mouth tightened. I dislike phrases like that. So you knew. I knew enough to be uncomfortable. I did not know how far it had gone. How far has it gone? She spread her hands slightly. Apparently as far as a passport. I looked back at the notation. Birth, October 3rd. Deed, delayed until family settled. Family settled. Even that phrase hurt now. It sounded like a room being tidied after a spill, not a child's beginning being buffered and rearranged until it fit a cleaner story. What do meal support notes mean? I asked. Velma stood again, went to another drawer, and returned with a spiral notebook I recognized before she even laid it down. Blue plastic cover, white label. Linda Caskey's square writing, meal rotation / new moms / recovery. This stayed here a while because Linda always forgot to take it back, Velma said. Eventually, Evelyn tucked a few pages into the office file to cross-check delivery overlaps. She opened to a page halfway through. Rachel Mercer, baby boy. October 6th. Bev soup. October 8th. Linda casserole. October 9th. Evelyn meal. October 12th. June bread / eggs. October 15th. Bev repeat. Restless nights / call before noon. I closed my eyes. The dates stood there clean as frost. When I opened them, Velma was watching me the way old women sometimes watch men when they know comfort would insult them. This isn't church gossip, I said, and heard how foolish it sounded. No, she said, it isn't. I ran one finger under October 6th, then stopped because touching it felt obscene. Why is Daniel listed as parent on the clean copy? Velma's expression shifted. Not surprise. Care. That came later. How much later, I don't know exactly. Months, maybe a little more. There were forms brought back in. Updated family information. You know how people do when they want the bulletin, right? I did know. That was the trouble. I knew exactly how churches preferred their stories once the messiest weather had passed. Velma reached for the blanket again and lifted one edge. Your Evelyn told me something else that day. I looked up. She said, mercy should not require amnesia. I had to turn my head because grief moved through me so sharply it felt indecent to display. Evelyn in this room. Evelyn carrying truth in cloth. Evelyn saying the sentence I had lived too softly to hear. When I looked back, Velma's face had gentled. Tom, I am sorry. That was when another cost arrived. I understood that my wife had not merely been loving harder than I knew. She had likely been lonely in it, carrying a truth-keeping burden inside our own family, while I stood nearby being useful, being calm, being the kind of man people praise when women are doing the actual moral lifting. I gathered the pieces on the table slowly. The blanket, the caption card, the copied note. My hands did not shake. I almost wished they would. Shaking would have been easier than the stillness. Does anyone else know you kept this? I asked. Velma glanced toward the cracked open door. No one who matters now. No one who mattered then. She gave me a long look. Linda knew the dates because she ran meals. Evelyn knew because she kept real life in order. I suspect Rachel knew more than she admits. Daniel knew enough to stand in the clean copy. She paused. As for the rest of us, churches are very good at knowing something is being softened and deciding softness is probably charitable. I almost said something bitter about that. Instead, I folded the blanket and slid the note into the envelope. At the door, Velma touched my sleeve lightly. "Tom." I waited. "Do not let them make this about your grief." That was the closest thing to a warning she could give, and it chilled me more than the notation had, because it meant she had already heard the shape Rachel would use. I drove home with the church heater blowing too warm against my legs, and the envelope on the passenger seat like a passenger that deserved a seatbelt. The whole town looked offensively ordinary. People carrying dry cleaning, a landscaping truck at the Methodist church, 2 teenage boys on bikes near the park. If the world had any manners, I thought it would have darkened a little to match the inside of my skull. When I got home, the house received me as it always did. Front door, swelling slightly in the frame, faint beeswax smell from the hall table, the grandfather clock in the living room, 1 minute slow because I had not wound it properly since Easter. But it no longer felt like a place built only from memory. It felt like a place that had been taking notes behind my back. I set the envelope on the kitchen table and stood in the center of the room listening. Refrigerator hum, clock tick, distant crows, the sounds of a house keeping its own counsel. Then I saw something I had missed the day before. In the back hall by the mudroom just beyond the closet where I had found the boards, there was a narrow storage room no bigger than a decent walk-in pantry. We had always called it the overflow room. Extra folding chairs, holiday platters, flower vases from funerals that never made their way back to the proper cupboards. I had gone in and out of it for years without thought, because it was not sacred the way the kitchen was, or sorrowful the way our bedroom had become. It was a place for things between uses. The door was ajar. That alone meant nothing. I had probably left it that way when pulling boxes. But from where I stood, I could see on the built-in shelf at shoulder height a neat stack of white cards banded with a rubber strap. I walked toward it with the low, mean feeling that comes when a man already knows he's about to dislike what he sees. The room smelled of cardboard, old floral foam, and the stale sweetness of dried ribbon. Light from the back door window reached only part way in, leaving the shelves at the rear in a grainy dusk. On the second shelf sat the stack of cards I had glimpsed. Beside them lay 2 fine-tip pens, a package of removable adhesive squares, and a photo corner applicator Rachel had bought years ago when she got serious about family memory boards for church and school and anniversary parties. I took the cards down. The top ones were blank. The next few were printed in different fonts, trimmed cleanly. Then I began to see names. Easter at Grandpa's first Christmas in the new house, Daniel reading to Owen. Owen's first Father's Day with Dad. The words made me go still, not because they were lies outright, because they were evidence of assembly, memory prepared in advance, labeled, relabeled, stacked in this dim little room off the mudroom where serving dishes and foam boards and church remnants lived together in tidy suspicion. I kept going. Welcome home, baby Owen, our little miracle. Finally settled. The Hale family begins. Finally settled. My skin went cold. Under that card lay another hand, written then crossed out, hard enough to scar the cardstock beneath. A hard start held by Grace. Crossed out. Below it, in Rachel's tidy later handwriting, a beautiful beginning. I do not know how long I stood there reading through those cards, but by the end, the shape of the thing had changed for me completely. This was no longer one panicked administrative decision in a painful season. This was maintenance, ongoing, deliberate. Years of selecting which version got displayed, printed, mounted, stored, and repeated. There were labels for church boards, labels for school timelines, labels for framed photos, a little packet clipped together marked backup wording, another marked use after print. Every soft phrase that had drifted through my kitchen over the last 24 hours was here in cardstock in black ink. Hard season. Beautiful beginning. Finally settled. Family started. Consistency. Peace. I sat down on an old folding chair and laid the cards across my knees. The room around me seemed smaller than it had any right to be. Not because of the shelves. because I suddenly understood how much work had gone into keeping the chronology soft and how close I had lived to that work without seeing it for what it was. There was one more card near the bottom bent with a strip of tape still stuck to the back. Owen. Matthew. October 3rd. The date had been partially scribbled over. Not enough to hide it completely, just enough to blur it if you were in a hurry and wanted to believe the cleaner version was always the only one. I stared at that card until my eyes burned. Then I looked up at the little room itself. The shelves, the stacked boards, the pens, the photo corners, the event boxes. Nothing supernatural, nothing dramatic. Just the ordinary workshop where family stories had been prettied into place year after year, while I stood 2 rooms away making coffee and calling that closeness. My old false belief did not crack all at once. It collapsed. I had believed all my life that once church women and casseroles and registry books were involved, the underlying thing might be painful, might be messy, but it would remain fundamentally clean, not perfect, just honest at the center. The church's participation had reassured me. My wife's labor had reassured me. Rachel's softness had reassured me. Even Daniel's practical steadiness had reassured me. Standing in that back hall storage room with a stack of alternate family memory labels in my lap, I understood that all of those things had not protected the truth. They had helped dress the lie. They had helped dress the lie. I stayed in that back hall storage room longer than a man should stay in a room built for extra folding chairs and funeral vases. The air in there always ran a little cooler than the rest of the house because the vent barely reached it, and after a while the chill began to work through my shirt. Still, I did not move. I sat with those cards spread over my knees and the little shelf of memory tools above me, pens, adhesive squares, photo corners, and felt the whole shape of my family rearranging itself into something colder and far more deliberate than I had wanted to believe. The worst part was not the cards themselves. It was the voice I could hear behind them, not raised, not frantic, not vicious, warm, reasonable, efficient, a beautiful beginning, finally settled. The Hale family begins. Every line sounded like something a decent woman would write for a church board, a school poster, a little framed collage for a hallway table. That was what made them dangerous. They turned revision into decoration. They made the cleaned version not only easier to repeat, but easier to love. I set the cards on the floor and looked up at the storage shelves again. 3 white archive boxes sat on the highest shelf, each labeled in Rachel's hand, with the same tidy, slightly right-leaning print she had learned from Evelyn and softened into something more contemporary over the years. Family photos, school projects, church memory. Church memory. I rose carefully, pulled the little step stool from behind the folded card table and reached for that box first. The cardboard scraped softly against the shelf and showered a little dust down the front of my shirt. I carried it into the kitchen because I had crossed some line in myself by then and no longer wanted to do truth's work in half-light. I set the box on the table where I had once helped Owen color turkeys for Thanksgiving place cards and cut through the tape seal with the bone-handled letter opener Evelyn's father had carried in his lunch pail for 30 years at the Goodyear plant. Inside were folders, envelopes, clear sleeves, and little bundles of caption tags held together with paper clips. Not chaos. Never chaos. Rachel's order. Rachel's correction. At the top sat a folder marked Baby/Early Years. I opened it and felt my throat tighten. There were photographs I remembered, but not as they were here. In one, Rachel stood in my kitchen holding Owen drawn and exhausted and still beautiful in the wrecked way new mothers sometimes are when sleep has left them but stubbornness has not. Evelyn stood behind her at the stove in an apron looking over one shoulder as if someone had spoken her name. In the original memory, Daniel did not belong there because Daniel had not been there yet. Here in the clear sleeve, the photo had a small typed caption beneath it, "Home at last." Not wrong exactly. Only selected. Under that was another photo from the church foyer, with the white mums and the ribbon and Rachel in the green dress I had remembered upstairs on the bed. Daniel stood beside her in this one, but I saw at once what I had never seen before: the distance. Half a step too far to be instinctive. The hand on her back placed carefully, not naturally. A man stepping into the frame of a family, not yet fully his. The caption below read, "A new season begins." I looked from the picture to the caption and knew with a clarity that embarrassed me that I had let language do half the deceit for them. Not lies blunt enough to force resistance. Phrases, soft transitions, a new season, finally settled, a beautiful beginning. Every one of them a clean sheet spread over a mess people were too polite to identify. I kept going. There were old church bulletins in protective sleeves, one with Owen's name listed under prayer concerns from the week after his birth, but not under celebrations where most babies went. Another with Rachel's name in a private assistance committee. Note I had somehow never looked at closely. There was a receipt from the pharmacy with infant formula circled, a preschool questionnaire copy, a card from Linda Caskey with a little yellow duck on the front and the words, "Sleep when you can." "Dear Heart" written inside in her church lady loop. Then I found the pediatric reminder card. It was tucked into the back of a folder, as if it had slipped there accidentally. White card stock, the corners rounded from being handled. Dr. Elaine Sutter, Pediatric Associates. First weight check. October 8th. Baby Owen Mercer. Mercer. Not Hale. I sat very still. It is possible, I suppose, for a pediatric office to write the wrong last name on a card in a chaotic week. Possible. But set against the blanket. The meal notebook. The church notation. The early caption card. And the later cleaned versions, it no longer felt like chaos. It felt like sediment. Layer after layer settling until the original thing was almost buried. Owen Mercer. I said it aloud once very quietly, and the kitchen seemed to hear me. My own last name. I had assumed because Daniel had been around long enough, and because people said what they said, and because I was a man, trained by my own gentleness to accept transitions when they arrived wrapped in calm voices, that Owen had simply become Hale in the ordinary, legal, emotional way family stories sometimes do. A child takes the name of the man raising him, life steadies, records catch up, people move on, but the reminder card made the chronology raw again. Mercer first, Hale later, which meant the changing had been visible, formal, tracked, which meant there had been a period when the family story still had edges and somebody, maybe several somebodies, had spent years sanding them down. The phone rang on the wall by the pantry, and I jumped hard enough to hit the table with my thigh. Daniel. I let it ring twice before picking up. Tom. Daniel. His voice carried the same graveyard calm tone he used at funerals and board meetings. A voice that implied steadiness while subtly establishing that he was the man most qualified to manage disturbance. "Rachel told me you went to the church office." "I did." A pause. "I wish you'd called me first." "I'm sure you do." He let that pass. "I'm coming by." "That's not necessary." "It is." I almost told him not to, then stopped myself. Something in me had begun to turn in the last day, and it was not only suspicion, it was method. If Daniel wanted to come, let him come. Let him stand in my house and explain himself while I listened with better ears than I had ever used on him before. "All right," I said. "Come by." He arrived 20 minutes later, carrying none of the outward signs of a man under pressure. No haste in the driveway, no loud door shut, no forced brightness. Just Daniel in his charcoal quarter zip and pressed jeans shoes wiped clean before he stepped onto my kitchen mat, as if he were entering a home where manners still mattered. That too was part of him. He was always correct on the surface, enough so that a lesser lie could have lived under him forever. I did not invite him to sit. I left the table as it was. The blanket lay folded but visible. The caption card sat in one stack. The pediatric reminder card rested beside the meal notebook page copy I had made at the church office. The envelope in Evelyn's hand sat near the salt cellar. Nothing arranged theatrically. Just enough truth in one place that the room no longer belonged to softness. Daniel's eyes moved over the table once and came back to me. He did not look surprised. He looked tired. "That's a lot," he said. "Yes." He pulled out a chair anyway and sat down as if this were a meeting whose agenda had arrived before he did. "Rachel's upset. I imagine she is. She feels blindsided." I looked at him for a long second. Blindsided. She thought this had been settled years ago. I sat down across from him. Settled and true are not the same thing. His jaw flexed once. "No." That was the first straight answer he had given me since this began, and because of that it landed like a small confession. I said, "How long have you known the passport date was false?" He rested his forearms on the table and linked his hands. Not defensive. Deliberate. I knew it had been shifted for consistency. "Say false." He met my eyes. I knew it did not match his birth date. There was a peculiar relief in hearing a thing named plainly, even when the plainness bruises you. I breathed out once through my nose. "When? Not at the beginning. At the dedication." He hesitated. "No. Then, when after Rachel and I married." I sat back. The answer did two things at once. It spared him the earliest lie and implicated him in all the later ones. "You married her anyway," I said. "Yes, and agreed to this." His voice stayed low. "I agreed to protect the life we were building." I looked at the blanket. By changing a child's beginning. By making sure his beginning didn't keep getting weaponized by adults. Which adults? That made him pause. There it was again, that tiny withholding that told me where the deeper rot might be. Rachel's lie was one thing. The system around it was another. Who exactly had needed the revised date? The church ladies' school folders. Some man from before Daniel legal papers. I did not yet know. But I knew by then that Daniel's calm always hid calculations. He said, "Tom, there were custody questions. There were forms. There was a man who could have made a mess of things if we had left timelines loose." The room sharpened. "What man?" He glanced toward the window, then back at me. "Rachel didn't tell you everything then? That much is now obvious." She was ashamed. "No," I said. "She was managed." His face changed. "Not much." "Enough." "Be careful," he said. There was no menace in it. No raised voice, just caution, almost tender. That was what made it worse. Of what? Of turning this into a purity test after the fact. You know what those months were like. I know what I was allowed to know. He drew one hand back and adjusted his watch band. Same motion as before. I saw it now. A pressure release, a self-correction. That's unfair. Maybe. It is. I leaned forward. "Did you help change the passport application?" He did not answer fast enough. I did not need him to, but I waited anyway. Finally, he said I signed where I was asked to sign once I was legally in a position to do so. The sentence was clean and bloodless and morally filthy. I felt something in me settle then, not into peace, but into focus. Daniel was not merely the practical man who had stood near the lie after the fact. He had helped institutionalize it, not out of greed, not out of cruelty, out of the kind of male orderliness that mistakes control for rescue. "You made yourself the father on paper," I said. "I became his father in every way that matters. That is not what I asked." His calm held. "No, it isn't." It would have been easier if he had flared up. If he had pounded the table or cursed or demanded I mind my own business. Calm men who lie for family order are harder to fight because they make resistance look like hysteria. "Why August 19th, I asked. He looked at the pediatric card, at the envelope, at the blanket, because it aligned cleanly with what he was silent, with what Daniel. With the date range that eliminated overlap. Overlap with whom he rose then and crossed to the sink, not because he needed water, but because moving let him think. He stood with one hand on the counter, looking out through the lace curtain above the sink into the side yard, where Evelyn's hostas had gone ragged with the season. With the period before Rachel and I formalized things, he said at last. That was the decent, dishonest version again. I heard it this time. I stood too. Say it plain. He turned. It made it easier to close the door on a man who had no business trying to use biology as leverage after disappearing when she needed him. There it was. Not the whole of it, but enough. A man from before Daniel. A legal threat, or at least the possibility of one. A child who had once been Mercer and later became Hale. A shifted timeline that did not just make Rachel look tidier, but made paternity and access cleaner in the eyes of institutions that prefer paper to truth. I thought of Owen tracing his own passport date with one finger on my kitchen table. What was his name, I asked. Daniel's face went still. What was his name? That is not relevant now. It is as if my grandson's birth date was altered to erase his claim. Daniel came back to the table but did not sit. Tom, listen to me. Rachel was drowning. The man had already proved he could not be trusted. He resurfaced when there was talk of legal responsibility, then vanished again when it required actual constancy. By the time I was in the picture, the only humane thing to do was establish stability. I said, humane. Yes. Is that the word you use when you falsify a child's documents? His eyes flashed, then cooled almost at once. Do you want moral vocabulary, or do you want the truth of what saved that boy from years of confusion? I almost laughed, and there was no humor in it at all. You mean the truth that you have all been afraid of? He shook his head slowly. No. I mean the truth that you are romanticizing chaos because Evelyn is gone, and the blanket gave you something solid to hold. There it was. Velma's warning returned whole in my ears. Do not let them make this about your grief. I felt the sting of it, and because I was not the man I had been 2 days earlier, I let the sting sharpen me instead of shame me. My grief, I said quietly, did not write those cards in the storage room. Daniel's gaze did not flicker, but the silence did. You found those? Yes. That room is full of old project junk. No, I said, it's full of revised memory. He looked at me for a long moment, then pulled the chair out and sat again. When he spoke next, his voice had changed. Not louder, more careful. He had understood finally that I was not going to be eased backward into my old role. What do you want? He asked. I thought of how often people ask, that when what they mean is, how much trouble are you willing to make? I want my grandson's life told straight. And if the straight telling harms him, it already has. That is an opinion. It is a child asking which birthday belongs to him. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the table once, then stopped himself. Rachel believes she protected him from shame. Rachel taught him there was shame to protect. He did not answer that. We sat in silence while the refrigerator motor hummed and cut off again. Then he said something that moved the floor under me 1 more inch. There was a mediator. I looked up sharply. What mediator family court intake? It never fully went to hearing. There was a pre-filing process during the transition. Transition, I repeated. His mouth tightened. During the period before I adopted him legally. Adopted. The word sat between us like a door I had never been told existed. I stared at him. You adopted Owen? He held my eyes. Yes. Without telling me the birth date had been altered. Rachel wanted a clean line before bringing more people into it. More people. Not her father. More people. I sat back slowly. The room seemed to lean. Not because the adoption shocked me in itself. Men adopt children every day for reasons ranging from noble to practical. Because it clarified the betrayal. They had not merely softened family memory. They had reorganized legal fatherhood and time documents around a false date while leaving me to believe I was standing inside something rough but honest. When I said, 7 years ago, and the mediator file has the original date, he did not answer. He did not need to. The silence was answer enough. I said, I want the file. He stood at once. No. It was the first hard word he had given me. Now we were somewhere real. You don't get to tell me no. In my own house, I said. He picked up his car keys from the table where he had set them. I'm telling you this because I'm trying to keep you from doing something you can't take back, like altering a child's documents. His face closed. You think this is simple because you came in at the end. I was kept at the end. That was for your own protection too. The sheer audacity of that sentence almost took my breath. My protection. You know how you are when grief gets hold of an idea. There it was. Calm, careful, weaponized. He was not threatening me with force. He was repositioning me. Widower, elder, tender-minded, fragile in the wrong ways. A man who might not bear the hard realities of family mess and therefore ought not be trusted with all of it. I stood very still. When I spoke, I made my voice as quiet as his. Get out. He looked at me. Get out of my house, Daniel. He did not argue. That told me a great deal. Men who think they still hold the higher ground usually argue. Men who realize they have shown too much prefer to retreat and reframe later. At the door he turned. Rachel is terrified you're going to make Owen's life unstable out of principle. I said, then Rachel should have thought of that before teaching him to distrust his own name. After he left, I locked the front door. I had not done that in broad daylight in years. Not because I believed Daniel would come back by force. Because the house had changed categories in my mind. Until that moment, it had been a place where I felt wounded. After that moment, it became a place where evidence had to be protected. I gathered the table into order, not tidied away. Ordered, blanket at the head, envelope under it, pediatric card to the right, caption cards in date sequence, meal notebook copy and registry copy together. I laid them across the kitchen table the way one lays out a life on an operating tray before deciding where to cut. Then I took out a legal pad. That was the shift. Small, almost laughably small from the outside. An old man at a kitchen table with a pad and a pen. But I knew what it meant because I knew what I had been until then. I had been reacting, hurting, remembering. Now I began to sequence. October the 3rd birth date per blanket / Velma note / meal notebook. October 8th first weight check card / Owen Mercer. October 9th. Evelyn Lyd Rachel plus baby. November 17th. Dedication / delayed until family settled later. Daniel enters stable frame 7 years ago, adoption / mediation intake passport. August 19th / false line. I wrote it twice because the first time my hand shook. Then I wrote names. Velma, Linda, Daniel, Rachel, mediator, mediator. If the file existed and carried the original date, then the lie had passed through at least one formal threshold. And if Daniel knew that he knew more than he had said. The phone rang again at 3. This time I did not have to look at the caller ID. Rachel. I answered without greeting. Her voice came measured and hurt. Daniel says you threw him out. I told him to leave. He was trying to help. He was trying to reposition me. A beat. Dad? No. We are past that tone now. She exhaled slowly. I could picture her standing at her counter, one hand on the edge, eyes closed, gathering softness around herself like a shawl. I need you to hear me all the way through. I heard you yesterday all the way through. That's the problem. You're scaring Owen. That one landed because it was designed to. My grip tightened on the receiver. How? He can feel this. Then answer him straight. He is 8. You keep saying that as if childhood is the proper season for deceit. Her voice frayed, then recovered. This is exactly why I tried to shield you from the legal side of it. The legal side? Yes. You mean the part where you let me go on believing his story was one thing while you built another? That is not fair. No. I looked at the blanket. Fair would have been truth. The line was silent long enough that I thought she might hang up. When she spoke again, she had gone softer than ever, the way some people do when they are closest to rage. You loved Mom's way of loving because she made difficult things feel gentle. But you are rewriting her now if you think she wanted every ugly fact dragged into daylight. I closed my eyes. That was the cruelest move she had made yet, and perhaps the most skillful recruit the dead woman again. Use my love for Evelyn as a mirror that would bend back toward Rachel's version. The trouble was that 2 days earlier it might have worked. Your mother, I said, went to Velma with the blanket and said the record must remain true somewhere. Rachel said nothing. She also said mercy should not require amnesia. That silence cost me almost as much as any confession could have. Not because it proved she had known those exact words, because it proved the words fit too well to resist. She was trying to protect me, Rachel whispered at last. No. She was trying to protect Owen. The line crackled softly. Then Rachel said, You don't know what that man was like. Not who. That man. A man who had once been absent enough to deserve erasure, perhaps, or frightening enough that erasure had felt holy to her. I did not yet know, and I was old enough by then to understand that not every bad man forfeits factual truth about a child, but the sentence told me where one of Rachel's moral permissions had come from. She had not simply wanted a cleaner life. She had wanted a sealed one. What was his name, I asked. No. Rachel. No. I am not bringing him back in by speaking him into this house again. Again. I wrote the word on the pad while she was talking. You already brought him in, I said. You brought him in every time you changed the shape of the story to keep him out. She made a small sound, then not quite a sob, not quite anger. Real pain, perhaps. That was what made all of it so hard. She was not faking the pain. She was using it. When she spoke next, her voice was steady again. If you go looking for old legal files, old names, old dates, you are not doing that to me alone. You are doing it to Owen. No, I said. I'm doing it for him. That is your grief talking. I almost thanked God for the predictability of people once you know their system. No, I said again. That is yours. She hung up. By evening, I had made one more decision. Linda Caskey. Velma had records and moral clarity. Linda had lived the practical sequence. Meals, returns, nights, doorways. Churchwomen see more than court mediators and less than mothers, which can make them the most dangerous witnesses of all if their consciences ever wake up. I drove to Linda's house just after 6 before I could talk myself into a gentler, safer time that would never come. She lived in a modest ranch off Sycamore Lane, with 2 ceramic geese by the porch steps and a porch swing her late husband had built in the 80s. When she opened the door, she was wearing a navy cardigan and holding a dish towel as if the whole town's women had decided to confront me only while half in the kitchen. Tom. Her face changed at once. Oh dear, I need to ask you something. She looked over her shoulder toward the TV room, then stepped out and pulled the storm door mostly shut behind her. The porch smelled faintly of fried onions and fallen leaves. This about Rachel, she asked. Yes. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Not surprise. Weariness. I wondered when it would finally come apart. That sentence had so much in it, I nearly missed my next breath. You wondered? I didn't know the shape of it now, she said quickly. Only that the old shape never really got buried the way people pretended. I held out the copy of the meal notebook page. You wrote this? She looked at it and twisted her wedding ring once around her finger. Yes. Were there more pages? Her mouth tightened. Tom. Linda. She looked at me a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Come around back." Not on the porch. The kitchen of her house was warmer than mine and smelled of beef stew. She did not ask whether I wanted any. She pulled out a chair for me at the small laminate table under the window and disappeared into the laundry room. When she came back, she had the blue spiral notebook from the church office in one hand and a floral tote in the other. "There are copies," she said, "and there are things I never brought back." She tipped the tote onto the table. Out came a stack of folded meal schedules, a church care team phone tree, 3 gas receipts clipped together, and 1 manila folder with family court intake written across the top in black block letters. I looked at the folder and felt the room narrow. "I drove Rachel there," Linda said. "First appointment only." Evelyn sat in back with the baby while I waited in the lot. She sat across from me, both hands flat on the table. I told myself at the time that I was helping a girl survive. Maybe I was. But there's helping someone survive, and there's helping bury the wrong thing. I opened the folder. At the top was a preliminary intake form. Mother Rachel Mercer. Child Owen Mercer. Birth date October the 3rd. Potential father contest/support issue. Temporary care concerns. I stared at the line until it stopped swimming. Potential father contest. Not just absence. Contest. "He filed," I said. Linda nodded once. Threatened to, then vanished, then surfaced through a cousin, then vanished again. It was all ugly. "What was his name?" She hesitated. "Nathan Mercer." The name struck with a sick, dull force because it was no longer faceless. Not a principal. Not that man. Nathan Mercer. A man with my grandson's first last name, a man who had once been concrete enough to require intake forms and legal advice and church rides and meal schedules. Did he sign anything? Not then. Maybe never. I don't know. I only know what the intake woman said in the parking lot afterward, that dates matter and timing matters. And if Rachel wanted Daniel later to adopt, they'd need clean records and a quiet period. Linda swallowed. That was the first time I heard anyone use the word clean. The room seemed to lose air. There it was again. Clean, cleaner, clean copies, clean line. A whole moral language of laundering. "What did Evelyn say?" I asked. Linda looked at me with such old sorrow I almost wished I had not. She said, "Children are not stains." I had to look down. That was the moment, I think, when grief finally stopped being only ache and became instruction. Not because I had found more proof, because every piece of proof now came attached to my wife's clearer conscience. She had seen exactly what was being done. Not loudly, not theatrically, just fully. And she had tried in the ways available to her to keep one truthful thread alive, through it. I took the intake copy, the notebook page, the gas receipts, everything Linda let me copy or photograph, and carried them home in the envelope from the church office. Outside, the air had turned cold enough that my breath showed when I crossed my driveway. The lights in my house glowed gold through the front windows, and for the first time in 40 years I had the irrational feeling that the place was not waiting for me kindly. Inside, I locked the door again. That night, the most memorable thing that happened was not loud. That is the nature of houses when they turn on a man. They do it through nearness. I was in the kitchen after 10, laying the copies and originals into sequence under the lamp when I heard a soft scrape in the back hall. Not a crash, not an intruder's dramatic misstep. A careful scrape followed by the faint click of cardboard shifting. I went still. The house answered with silence so complete it seemed intentional. My first thought was animal. We get field mice in the wall every few winters, and once a raccoon had made an ambitious attempt at the screened porch. But animals do not pause like guilty people. I switched off the kitchen lamp. Darkness dropped through the room in layers, leaving only the stove clock and the moon-gray wash from the sink window. I stood listening. The back hall gave another tiny sound. A drawer or box edge brushing wood. Someone was in the overflow room. I moved without switching lights back on. Not stealthy the way young men move in movies. Carefully, because I knew every squeak in that hall, and because there is a particular humiliation in being an older man approaching danger in his own home, conscious of knees and floorboards, and the way your heart sounds louder than your steps. At the end of the hall, the mudroom window cast a narrow, cold stripe across the floor. The storage room door stood open 1 hand's width more than I had left it. Then a figure moved in the darkness beyond it. "Who's there?" I said. The figure went still. Then Rachel's voice came low and terribly composed. "Dad, it's me." Every hair on my arms lifted. She stepped partly into the strip of light from the mudroom coat, still on and hair pinned up, one hand around the doorknob behind her, as if she had meant to slip in and out without disturbing anything. Not a burglar. Worse. My daughter in my dark back hall after 10 at night, standing in the room where she kept the revised story supplies. "What are you doing?" I asked. She did not look embarrassed. She looked inconvenienced. I knocked. "No, you didn't. I didn't want to wake you. I wasn't asleep." Her eyes adjusted to the dark on my face. "I came for the bookmark and some church board materials I forgot. In the dark. I didn't need the overhead. That was the thing about her. She never gave you quite enough absurdity to dismiss, nor enough plainness to trust." I took 1 step closer. "What exactly were you taking?" She held up her free hand. The red plastic bookmark, nothing else visible. But behind her, in the dark of the little room, I could just make out 1 archive box sitting crooked on the lower shelf where I had not left it. "Turn on the light," I said. "Dad, turn on the light." For the first time, I heard a true edge under her softness. "You are treating me like I'm sneaking through your house." A long beat. Then I reached past her and clicked the switch myself. The light came on harsh and yellow. Rachel blinked once. On the floor beside the step stool sat the family photos box with its lid open. Inside folders had shifted. The stack of label cards was no longer banded. 1 small bundle lay half hidden behind her boot. She saw me see it. "Give me the bookmark," I said. Her fingers tightened around it. "You've been going through things that were never meant to be evidence." That sentence did more than accuse. It admitted. Things meant. "I'll ask once more," I said. "What were you taking?" She looked at me with a sadness so practiced it almost had dignity. "Pieces of my own life." "No," I said. "Pieces of the version." Something cold passed across her face, then quick as a shadow crossing a window. She bent, picked up the loose bundle from behind her boot and straightened. The top card faced me. "The Hale family begins. I am not going to let you tear apart every settled thing because you found old scraps and decided Mom had left you a mission." That was the closest she had come yet to anger, and it was still spoken in a voice most people would call gentle. The calm of it frightened me more than shouting would have. "You came into my house in the dark," I said to remove record pieces after I started asking questions. "They're caption cards. They're evidence." Her mouth compressed. That was the moment I understood something final about the house. It was no longer merely a place that held clues. It had become contested territory, not through violence, through access, timing, retrieval. Who got to touch what before morning? I held out my hand. "Give them to me." "No." I stepped fully into the doorway, then blocking the only easy exit from the room. Rachel's eyes flicked past my shoulder toward the kitchen, calculating. Not escape exactly. Route, optics. If she brushed past me, then what an older father restraining his daughter in a hallway. She knew as well as I did how quickly truth can be made ugly by the wrong choreography. So did I. I lowered my hand. "You are not taking anything else tonight." She stared at me. Then, to my surprise, she set the cards back into the box herself. "Not surrender. Adaptation." "Fine," she said. "Keep your scraps." Why did you really come? I told you. No. Her chin lifted. Because I knew if you started sorting through years of family boards and project files with a wounded imagination, you would build a monster out of process. I almost said something useless then. Instead, I asked the better question. Who gave you a key that stopped her? The silence between us changed texture. I had not even known I was going to ask it until I did, but of course. I had locked the front door. The back was bolted when I checked before 10. She had not knocked. She had not rung. She had entered. Who gave you a key? I said again. Rachel looked away first. Not down, toward the mudroom window. We've had one for years. For emergencies. Who gave it to you? She hesitated one fraction too long. Mom did. I stared at her. No, I said. My wife did not give you a key to come into my dark house and remove boxes from a storage room. She gave it for family. Another line that might once have softened me. Not anymore. I turned and went to the kitchen, opened the junk drawer by the phone, and took out the small brass keyring where I kept the spare backdoor copy. Then I crossed to the little ceramic crock by the cookbook stand where Evelyn used to keep all family keys that were not currently in use. It held 2 old mailbox keys, 1 shed key, 1 church closet key, and 1 empty hook on the inside lip where a house duplicate had once hung. I looked back at Rachel, standing in the doorway. How long? I asked. She did not answer. How long have you been able to come into this house without me knowing, Dad? Don't make that sound sinister. The words came out of me before I planned them. Everything sounds sinister once the truth catches up to it. She flinched. Actual pain. I saw it and did not retreat from it. That was new in me. She left 10 minutes later without the cards, without the photo box, without the bookmark. I did not stop her at the driveway. I stood inside the locked front door and watched the tail lights disappear through the sugar maples. Then I changed every lock in the house I could change that night. Not by calling a locksmith. By hand, back door first, mudroom, then the side entry from the garage. I had enough replacement cylinders in the basement workshop because Hollow Creek roadmen accumulate such things and never explain why. It took me until after midnight. My knees ached. My knuckles skinned once on the storm door plate. Halfway through the second lock, I laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. A 71-year-old widower in reading glasses, rekeying his own doors, while his late wife's towel lay folded on the counter beside evidence of a family lie. But the laughter did not mean I thought it absurd after all. It meant I had crossed fully into action. By the time I finished, I understood 2 things I had not understood that morning. First, there would never be a safer, gentler time to confront this. Safety was the language the lie used to extend itself. Second, my credibility was now part of the battlefield. Daniel had already tried grief. Rachel had already tried memory. If I moved sloppily, they would move next to confusion. Older man, widower, fixated on objects, building monsters from process. That path was visible now, and because it was visible, I could plan against it. So I did. Saturday morning, I drove to a copy shop in the next town over, instead of the one by the grocery store where I might be seen too easily. I made clean copies of everything: blanket, close-up, casserole, lid, pediatric, card, meal, notebook page, registry note, intake sheet, caption cards, crossed-out labels. Then I put originals back into one manila envelope and copies into another. I called Velma and asked whether she would be in the fellowship kitchen after service Sunday as usual, helping sort return dishes. Yes, she said. And after one beat more, I imagine I had better be. I called Linda and asked the same. Her voice shook a little. Tom, are you sure? No, I said. I'm finished waiting to be sure enough. Then I called no one else. That too was strategy. Not broadening the circle, not making this gossip before witness, not giving Rachel time to get ahead of the shape of it. Just enough people with the right memories in the right room. Saturday afternoon, I laid everything out once more on my kitchen table, but not like a man overwhelmed now. like a man building sequence. The house no longer felt simply deceptive. It felt disciplined again, though, in a different way. Not because I trusted it, because I had begun to read it properly. The pantry, the back hall, the breakfast nook, the rooms had not betrayed me. I had misread their language. At dusk, I went upstairs and brought down the blanket. This time, when I folded it, I did not think of it as a relic. I thought of it as the first honest witness in the house. I laid it over the back of Evelyn's old dining room chair and stood looking at it while the last light left the windows. Then another memory came, not invited but exact. The dedication Sunday, not the public part, the hour after, back in this very kitchen. Evelyn at the sink rinsing out a glass dish Linda had brought. Rachel at the table staring at nothing while the baby slept in the carrier. Me carrying and folding chairs from the car. And Evelyn saying very quietly to Rachel, "Whatever gets cleaned up later, do not let anybody clean him up so much he disappears." At the time, I had thought she meant shame. That she did not want Rachel swallowing herself whole for the sake of appearances. Now I knew she had meant the child. His history, his rough beginning, his inconvenient facts. I set both hands on the chair back and bowed my head, not in prayer exactly, though maybe it became one. "I'm late," I said to the room, "but I'm here." Sunday morning, I woke before the alarm. The house felt watchful, but not against me anymore. Watchful the way a courtroom is watchful before people enter. I shaved carefully, pressed my shirt again, though it did not need it. Chose the dark tie Evelyn liked because she said it made me look like a man who could tell the truth without enjoying it. In the kitchen, I packed the envelopes, originals in one, copies in another. The pediatric card between sheets of plain paper so the corners would not bend. The caption cards clipped. The registry note in a sleeve. The intake copy at the bottom because I knew instinctively it would be the hardest blow and ought not be the first. Then I did something I had not done in 3 years. I opened the linen drawer by the stove and took out one of Evelyn's kitchen towels from the back of the stack, the good soft one with the faded blue stripe and a tiny scorch mark near one corner from when she once grabbed a skillet too fast. I shook it out and folded it lengthwise over my forearm. That was how she carried hot dishes to the church fellowship hall, not as decoration, as work, as steadiness. I did not think of it as borrowing her strength. I thought of it as finally understanding its shape. When I lifted the blanket in my other hand, the cloth felt heavier than when Owen had carried it to me, but no longer fragile, more like something that had survived being mishandled by people who needed it too much. At the door, I paused and looked back once. The kitchen table stood empty except for the light falling across it. The pantry door was closed. The back hall was still. The house did not feel innocent. It never would again. But it did feel aligned. The objects were in the right hands now. The sequence existed. The old false belief that a gentler time would come had died in me for good. I locked the front door behind me, stepped into the cold Sunday morning and crossed the porch with Evelyn's towel folded over my arm and the baptism blanket in my hand. By the time I turned the key in the ignition, I knew where the truth had to be spoken, not in a private phone call, not in my kitchen with only the liars and the wounded, not in whispers where softness could blur it again, in the fellowship kitchen, in the room where casseroles had been labeled, where meal trains had been coordinated, where dedication boards had been mounted, where the lie had learned to sound kind. I backed out of the drive and headed toward the church with everything ready and no honest road left back. By the time I pulled into the church lot, the first service was already letting out. People were stepping into the cold in 2s and 3s, coats buttoned at the chin, bulletins folded in gloved hands. The old men pausing where they always paused near the south hedge, as if weather and football scores had to be consulted before anyone could proceed to lunch. I sat in the car 1 moment longer than necessary, with the engine ticking down under me and the blanket folded on the passenger seat. The fellowship kitchen windows glowed yellow through the brick wing at the back of the building. I could almost smell it from where I sat without even opening the door, Coffee warming too long on a burner, dish soap, ham, glaze, butter. The faint mineral smell of industrial sinks and steam tables. 20 years of potlucks, funerals, bridal showers, baby dedications, committee suppers, and mercy casseroles had soaked that room so thoroughly into the life of our church that most people walked into it and felt comfort before they thought of anything else. That morning I looked at those lit windows and thought of machinery. Not because the kitchen was false, because it had been used. Every good thing can be used if frightened enough people agree that a soft lie is kinder than a hard fact. Meals, prayer, witness, help. The room itself was innocent. The choices inside it had not been. I took the blanket in one hand, the envelopes in the other, and looped Evelyn's faded blue-striped towel over my forearm. The air bit my ears on the walk from the car. Frost still silvered the grass in the low strip behind the fellowship hall. Someone had spilled coffee near the side entrance earlier, and the dark stain on the concrete carried that sweet burned smell all church coffee seems to share after it hits cold air. I went in through the back hall instead of the sanctuary side. It was quieter there. Coats on hooks, a bulletin board with next month's choir schedule pinned crooked, a cart of folded metal chairs against the wall. Voices traveling faintly from the fellowship room beyond in the easy Sunday murmur I had known for half my life. I could hear plates already, the small firm clink of serving spoons against Pyrex. The old floor tile gave under my shoes with that particular church building squeak that means wax and years. Velma was where she always was after service, at the long stainless counter in the fellowship kitchen, sorting returned dishes with a level of practical concentration that made her look almost peaceful. Linda stood at the opposite end with a stack of paper napkins and 2 covered pans already set aside for taking to one shut-in and one family with the flu. They both looked up when I came through the swing door. Velma's eyes went first to the blanket, then to my arm, then to my face. She did not ask whether I was still certain. She knew by then that certainty was not the issue. Linda swallowed visibly. "Tom." I set the envelopes on the counter near the old coffee urn. "I'm going to need you both to stay once everybody starts drifting in." Velma nodded once. "All right." Linda glanced toward the fellowship room. "You mean now?" "Yes." That frightened her. I could see it. And because I was no longer trying to make everyone comfortable before telling the truth. I let her be frightened. "I won't make a spectacle," I said, "but I'm not whispering this back into soft corners again." Velma set down the casserole lid in her hand. "Then don't." The kitchen around us moved in its usual Sunday choreography. A younger couple from the music team came in laughing about something and set down a crock pot of baked beans. Mrs. Harlan from the memorial committee asked Linda where the foil was. One of the middle school boys carried a crate of plastic forks in under his chin and nearly lost half of them at the door. None of them knew not yet that the room had changed the moment I came in carrying my wife's towel and my grandson's blanket. Rachel came through the fellowship room doorway 8 minutes later, with Daniel beside her and Owen one step in front of them, carrying a paper cup of lemonade from the children's table with both hands so carefully you would have thought it contained medicine. Rachel saw me at once. Daniel saw the envelopes and went still in that contained way of his that always looked to people who didn't know him like maturity. Owen saw the blanket. His eyes brightened for 1/2 second before he looked at his mother. That was all. But it was enough to tell me that some part of him had already learned objects could become dangerous depending on who held them. I crouched to his height before Rachel could redirect him. "Morning, buddy," he nodded. "Hi, Grandpa." I kept my voice easy. "Would you do me a favor?" He looked at Rachel first. She gave him the smallest possible smile. "If Grandpa needs a favor, you can hear him." That was for the room, for the watching edges of other people's polite inattention. "I need you to sit with Mr. Harlan in the fellowship room for a little while," I said. "Tell him about your science board and that cardboard bridge you built." Owen frowned. "Why?" "Because grown-ups need to talk about some paperwork, and I don't want you stuck waiting in a kitchen." He looked at the blanket again. Is it about my birthday? Rachel's shoulders went tight. Daniel moved 1 inch closer, not toward me, but toward the child, as if he could physically stabilize the question by shortening the space around it. I said, "It's about making something right." That was all I gave him. Not because I wanted to be vague, but because he was still 8, and a fellowship kitchen with women carrying hot dishes is no place to hear the full architecture of adult fare. Owen looked at me a long second. Then he nodded once, small and solemn, and went out to the fellowship room where Mr. Harlan, bless him, was already waving him over with a cookie in one hand and a church bulletin in the other. Only after the boy was gone did Rachel speak. "Dad, not here. Not loud. Never loud, soft enough that if anyone overheard it would sound like a daughter worried her father was overtired." "Yes," I said. "Here." Daniel stepped in with his careful boardroom voice. "Tom, we can go into the office." "No." Several heads in the fellowship room then turned back the way church people do when they sense tone but not content. Velma, without looking at any of us, shut the swing door between the kitchen and the fellowship room so it settled on its spring and dulled the noise. That was her contribution to spectacle control. Privacy enough for truth, not enough for evasion. Rachel glanced at the women nearest the sinks. "Could we have a minute?" "Stay," I said before anyone moved. That changed the room. Not with drama, with gravity. A few people who had been reaching for platters set them down. Mrs. Harlan's sister Jean straightened from the far counter with a bowl of slaw in her hands, and then, sensing this was not her business, placed it in the refrigerator and stayed where she was. Linda looked at the floor. Velma folded her paper-thin lips once and laid both hands on the counter. Rachel turned back to me. Her face was pale but composed. "You are making a mistake." I put the blanket on the stainless counter and unfolded only the stitched corner. "No," I said. "I made the mistake years ago when I let tenderness outrank truth. That was the first sentence in the room that belonged wholly to me." I felt it land. Daniel's eyes shifted to the women at the counter, then to the door. He was already calculating witnesses. How much of this could still be repositioned later as a misunderstanding, a grief episode, a painful family disagreement inflated by old records and raw feeling? So I took the first envelope and spread the copies out in sequence before he could find footing. Blanket, casserole lid, pediatric reminder card, meal notebook page, registry note, caption cards, and last, the family court intake copy. The kitchen went so quiet I could hear the fan hum in the vent above the stove. Rachel stared at the line of paper and cloth as if I had laid out her private organs. I said very evenly, "Owen asked me which birthday belonged to him. You told him his grandmother stitched the blanket wrong in a hard season. That was false." "Dad, do not interrupt me while I'm finally telling the truth." She stopped. The hurt on her face was immediate and exquisite. Another time in my life I might have backed down out of love for her before she even spoke. That too was part of why we stood where we were. I touched the blanket corner with one finger. "This says October 3rd. Your mother stitched it. She checked dates the way other people checked weather. She told Velma the record must remain true somewhere. Velma, to her credit, did not jump in. She simply said from the counter, 'She did.'" Rachel's eyes cut toward her. Shock, then anger, then something like wounded disbelief that the older woman she had likely counted among the safe would step out of line. Velma. But Velma had already crossed the age where younger people's pain can still govern her conscience. "Yes," she said. "She did." I moved to the casserole lid. This was in my pantry. October 9th. For Rachel and baby. Linda closed her eyes. Not refusal, endorsement. The room noticed it, then the pediatric card. This says Owen Mercer. First weight check October 8th. Daniel's jaw tightened. Rachel's hand went to her wrist thumb, rubbing the inside of it once before she caught herself. Then the meal notebook. Linda coordinated meals for that season. October 6th, October 8th, October 9th. Again after the date your mother stitched. Again before the date in the passport. Linda made a low sound in her throat, and then in a voice thinner than usual, but steady enough, said, "Those were the dates. I wrote them when I made the calls. Now the room really understood there was a shape here bigger than grief. Paper object witness. Sequence." Rachel looked from Linda to me, and then finally to Daniel, as if asking silently whether he meant to stop this. Daniel did not move. That was the first crack in their united front. He was too careful to choose open defiance against a laid-out chronology in a kitchen full of women who knew what dated masking tape meant. I laid the registry note next to the others. "This is from the church office. Owen's dedication was delayed until the family settled. Velma kept the original notation because your mother asked her not to let the date disappear. A woman near the refrigerator, I think it was Jean, though I cannot swear to it, made a sharp little intake of breath. That was the moment the lie stopped being private trouble and became communal injury. Not gossip. Injury. Because if the church had carried the family through that season, then the church had also been used as a laundering room for the story of it." Rachel found her voice then. "All right," she said softly. "If this is what we're doing, then let's do it honestly. No raised tone, no collapse. Just a slight straightening of the shoulders, as if she had decided softness alone would not save her now and she must pivot into dignity. If I had not known her as well as I did, I might have admired it. I never denied Owen was born in October," she said. "I said the paperwork was corrected later for consistency. That is not what you said to your son. He is 8, and you told him his dead grandmother made a mistake." Rachel's eyes flashed with pain again. "Because I would rather he think a tired woman stitched a date wrong than carry the whole ugly chain of what actually happened when he came into the world." "And what happened?" I asked. "Say it." She looked at Daniel first. He looked at the counter. That was the second crack. Rachel turned back to me. "A man left, then came back when there was leverage, then left again. There were threats. There were forms. There were lawyers who made it sound as though biology mattered more than safety. Daniel stepped in. Daniel stayed. Daniel married me. Daniel became his father in every way that mattered. And, yes, records were made consistent later because I was not going to leave a loose end in place for some irresponsible man to pull on. Several things happened inside me at once. One part of me hurt for her. For the young mother, she had been ashamed and exhausted and cornered by a world that always grants women just enough mercy to keep them standing and then charges interest for the rest of their lives. Another part of me saw what had to be seen every sentence she had just spoken put adult fear above the child's right to factual origin. I said, "You are describing your terror. Not his truth. He was a baby. He is not one now. He is still a child." "Yes," I said, "and children deserve not to be edited into somebody else's comfort." Daniel spoke for the first time in several minutes. "That is unfair." I turned to him. "No. What is unfair is helping alter a boy's documents and then standing in church for years as if steadiness alone absolved you." His face changed then. Not a collapse, a thinning, as though some private image of himself had been cut from the inside. "I gave him a life," he said quietly, "and took his beginning. That beginning was dangerous. Then the danger should have been named honestly." Rachel took one step toward me. "Honestly," she said, and now there was steel under the softness. "You want honesty. Here is honesty." Mom knew exactly what that man was. She knew the panic. She knew I was barely sleeping, barely eating, barely holding myself together. She knew Daniel was the only stable thing that entered that season. She understood why I needed the next version of our life to be clean. "No," I said. Rachel's chin lifted. "You don't get to tell me what she understood." At that, I reached for the last paper, the family court intake copy. I did not wave it. I did not dramatize the motion. I placed it down in front of her with 2 fingers careful as laying down a communion wafer. This says Nathan Mercer. It says potential father contest. It says Owen Mercer. It says October 3rd. The legal system could be forced to look at the truth. So instead of preparing to protect a child inside that truth, you changed the story around him. Rachel's face drained. Daniel closed his eyes once. The room had gone beyond silence now. It had become witness. Linda was crying quietly without making a sound. Velma stood with both palms on the steel counter, not leaning, not wavering. Jean had turned fully toward us. Mrs. Harlan, who had come in looking for serving spoons and stayed by the pie table, had one hand pressed to her throat. Rachel said, "You don't know what he would have done." "No," I said. "I know what you did." She stared at me. "He may have been useless. He may have been dangerous. He may have deserved to lose every path to that child. But that is not the same thing as turning your son's life into a polished story because shame frightened you more than fact." That was the sentence that broke her. Not into screaming, into exposure. Her shoulders dropped. The poise went out of her face all at once, and beneath it I saw not just my daughter, not just the practiced mother and churchwoman she had become, but the younger, rawer person who had built an entire adult structure out of not wanting to be that humiliated girl again. "Yes," she said. One word. Barely air. Then, louder. "Yes." Nobody moved. "I was ashamed," she said. "There. Is that what you want?" I was ashamed. I was ashamed that he came into the world while my life was collapsing, and everybody in this church knew it and brought casseroles and used soft voices and pretended not to notice. I could barely stand up straight. I was ashamed that Nathan only cared once there was paperwork to sign. I was ashamed that Daniel stepped into a mess that should have been no one's burden but mine. I was ashamed that every time I looked at Owen, I saw the whole ugly timeline before I saw the baby. So yes, when there was a way to straighten the line later, I took it. Her voice never rose. That made it worse. And after a while, she went on, eyes bright but steady. It stopped feeling like lying. It started feeling like mercy. The cleaner version was the truer life. Daniel was his father. The old mess was over. Why should a child carry dates that only opened doors to people who had failed him? I waited until she was done. Then I said, "Because the dates are his." The sentence landed differently from everything else. No moral flourish, no church language. Just ownership, truth stripped clean of adult theory. Rachel's mouth trembled, then hardened again. "You think this is noble because you get to arrive late?" "No," I said. "I think it is necessary because I arrived late." That was when I stopped being only the wounded father in the room and became finally the one willing to do what Evelyn had done for years, hold the line where emotion wanted blur. I touched the blanket again. "Your mother did not stitch a beautiful beginning," I said. "She stitched a true one." "There is a difference." Velma whispered, "Amen," so quietly, only those nearest heard it. Rachel turned toward her, then toward Linda, then toward the women at the edge of the room. I watched the realization move through her in real time. Softness was no longer protecting her. The community language she had used for years had shifted sides because the evidence was too domestic, too specific, too much of the room's own material to be dismissed as one widower's fixation. That was the collapse of her mask, not an emotional explosion, but the loss of control over moral atmosphere. Daniel spoke again, and this time his calm had a crack in it. "What do you want done?" he asked. There it was at last. Not how do we smooth this, not can we talk privately. What do you want done? I looked at him, then at Rachel. "The passport corrected," I said. "The church archive corrected. Any school records that use the false date corrected. Owen told the truth in words he can bear. No more euphemisms. No more hard seasons standing where facts belong, and no more entering my home with an old key or touching a single-family record in it without my consent." Rachel flinched at that last one more than she had at the first 3. The house mattered to her. Of course it did. It was part of the machinery. My kitchen had been one of the rooms in which her corrected life took shape. "That is punishment," she said. "No," I said. "Punishment would be me wanting to humiliate you. I do not. This is repair, and repair is not the same thing as comfort." Her eyes filled. "You can't stand there and talk to me about repair while tearing open everything I survived." I nearly stepped toward her. I nearly softened. Then I saw in the corner of my vision the pediatric card with Owen Mercer written across it and the blank rectangle where a dedication date had once been peeled clean from a board. I held my ground. "You survived it," I said. "He is still living inside what you did to survive it. No one in the room could look away after that." Rachel sat down heavily in the nearest metal chair as if her knees had simply left the matter to someone else. Daniel remained standing, but not in charge anymore. He had the look men get when they realize competence cannot solve what conscience allowed. Velma came forward then not to rescue anyone but to anchor the next step in something more than my anger. "The archive can be corrected," she said. "Not erased. Corrected. Original notation restored to primary file. Clean copy retained only with amendment attached." Rachel stared at her. "You kept all this?" Velma did not apologize. "I kept enough." Linda spoke next, wiping at her cheeks with one corner of a paper napkin. "I can give Tom the full meal notebook pages if copies are needed for school or for any legal correction. And I can sign an affidavit if it comes to that." She looked sick saying it, but she said it. Daniel looked at her in a kind of dull amazement. Perhaps it was the first time he had fully understood that ordinary older women with casserole logs can bring down a polished lie better than any attorney. "I can handle the passport file," he said after a moment. I turned to him. "No," that startled him. No. "You can cooperate. You do not handle." His nostrils flared once. The only visible sign that being displaced from the practical center of a problem wounded him more than he had admitted. "What then?" he said. "I choose the attorney." Rachel laughed once under her breath. It was not humor, it was disbelief. "Attorney?" "Yes." "Dad, for God's sake." "For God's sake," I said. And now my voice did rise one notch, not with rage but with force. "Do not use his name to ask me back into the same vagueness that put us here." The room went dead still. I saw the sentence hit her. Saw it hit all of them. That was the hero moment if a story needs one, not a dramatic gesture, not a speech men in bars repeat later, but the first time in my life I refused to let moral language soften a lie in real time. Rachel put both hands over her mouth for 1 second and then lowered them. She looked older than she had 30 minutes before. "I never wanted him to feel false," she said. I believe that I answered. That surprised her. Maybe because mercy spoken cleanly is harder to fight than accusation. "I believe you wanted to protect him," I said. "I also believe you protected your own shame with his records. Both things can be true." Tears spilled then finally, but without performance. No collapse into my chest, no reaching for me, just tears down a woman's face while the room around her held its ground. Daniel said very quietly, "If we correct the records, Nathan could resurface." "There it is," I said. He looked at me. "The real fear," I said. "Not confusion, not memory, not paperwork. Access." Rachel's eyes flashed up. "You don't know what he was capable of. Then that gets handled legally and honestly, not by building your son on a false date." Daniel's mouth tightened. He knew I was right. That was part of his punishment. Men like Daniel can endure being called cruel more easily than they can endure being shown they were cowardly while calling it care. Owen pushed through the swing door then before anyone could stop him. Everyone turned. He had Mr. Harlan's cookie napkin crumpled in one fist and a line between his brows I had seen on my own face in bathroom mirrors my whole life. "Why is everybody being so quiet?" he asked. Rachel stood up at once. "Honey, go back with Mr. Harlan." "No." No child should have to say that word in a room built by adult failures, but there it was. He looked at the blanket, then at me, then at the papers. His eyes fell on Rachel last, because children always look to the person they most need to trust when the air goes wrong. I moved before anyone else could, not to block him, to kneel again so he did not have to crane upward into a wall of frightened, grown people. "Come here, buddy." He came slowly. I did not touch him until he leaned in first. Then I put one hand on his shoulder. "You asked a good question at my house," I said, "and you deserved a straight answer right away." Rachel made a broken little sound behind me, but I did not look back. "The date on Grandma's blanket is your real birthday," I said. "October 3rd. He blinked once. "So the passport is wrong?" "Yes." Did Grandma know? Yes. That mattered to him more than the rest. I could see it. "Why would my passport be wrong?" he asked. The whole room held its breath. I chose the words as carefully as a man can choose words for a child when truth arrives late. "Because some grown-ups were scared when you were little," I said. "They thought if they changed some papers, life would stay steadier, but they should have told the truth instead." Owen thought about that. Children do not always react with the immediate emotion adults expect. Sometimes they test the structural part first. "So my birthday is October the 3rd, he said again. "Yes." "And Grandma put the right one?" "Yes." He nodded once, and then, to my shame and my love, leaned his forehead against my shoulder for one brief second, as if the matter most urgent to him had been deciding whether he could still trust the dead woman's hands. When he stepped back, he asked the question I had known somewhere in me would come eventually. "Did Mom lie?" Rachel made the sound again, sharper this time. Daniel stared at the floor. Velma crossed herself so discreetly I would have missed it if I had not been looking directly at nothing else. I said, "Your mom was wrong." That was what he could bear in that room. Owen looked up at Rachel. She was crying openly now. "Did you know my birthday?" he asked her. "Yes," she whispered. "Then why did you tell me the other one?" "Because shame frightened me more than truth," I thought. "Because you were easier to protect when edited. Because adults would rather sand a child smooth than admit what they themselves cannot bear to remember." Rachel said none of that. She crouched until she was eye level with him, and for the first time since this whole thing began, the softness left her voice and real plainness entered. "Because I was scared," she said. "And I thought if I cleaned things up enough, you wouldn't have to carry the hard parts." Owen looked at her the same way he had looked at me in my kitchen when no one answered fast enough. Then he asked, "Do I have to carry them now?" That was the question of the whole story in one child's mouth. Rachel closed her eyes. I answered before she could turn it into abstraction again. "No," I said, "not all at once. You only have to know what belongs to you. The rest is for grown-ups to fix honestly." He considered that, then nodded. Mr. Harlan appeared in the doorway at last, late enough to preserve what dignity there still was, and early enough to rescue the boy from the rest. "There you are," he said gently to Owen. "I've got the church's last oatmeal cookie held hostage out there." Owen looked at me for permission. I nodded. He took the cookie and went with the old man without another word. The swing door eased shut behind him. The kitchen seemed to exhale and then harden into the after. No one rushed the next part. That mattered. Justice done too quickly feels like appetite. This had to feel like cost. Rachel sat back down. Daniel took the chair beside her but did not touch her hand. I stayed standing because I had no wish to collapse into false equality now that the room had been cleaned enough to breathe. "We'll correct it," Daniel said at last. Rachel looked at him as if she were seeing him at some new angle too. "All of it," I said. "All of it," he answered. Velma, practical even in the middle of moral wreckage, asked, "Who handles the first calls?" "Monday." "I do," I said. Rachel lifted her head. "Dad?" "I do." I repeated. "You will be there. Daniel will be there. But I make the first calls." That might sound small to an outsider, It was not. For years, I had been the one thanked for support, while others governed the actual lines of the family story. Reclaiming the first core was not logistics. It was moral authority. Rachel let out a ragged breath and nodded once. We stayed another 40 minutes in that kitchen, not arguing now, but naming the practical sequence of repair. Attorney first, passport office second, school records after counsel, archive correction with notation rather than destruction, no records discarded, no boxes removed from my house. The old key surrendered by evening. Owen told again, more gently and more fully in my presence, and with no euphemisms. At one point, Jean quietly set a cup of coffee near my hand, without interrupting anything, and that small act of service nearly undid me more than the confrontation had. Because it reminded me what church care is supposed to feel like when it is not laundering somebody's fear. The old key came to me before lunch ended. Rachel took it from her purse and laid it on the counter between the blanket and the casserole lid. Brass, worn, ordinary, suddenly obscene in its history. I covered it with the towel and slid it into my coat pocket. No one hugged when we were done. That would have been indecent. Rachel looked at me once as the room began slowly, awkwardly to return to its fellowship rhythms around us. "I did love him," she said. I answered, "Then love him straighter now." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was no mask left, only fatigue and grief, and something raw enough that maybe in another season it could become repentance. Daniel asked if I wanted him to drive home with me. No. He nodded. He understood that this too was part of justice. He was no longer the man who managed aftermath in my place. I stayed through the end of the meal, not because I wanted company, but because leaving too fast would have felt like escape. I ate 2 bites of ham and a spoonful of scalloped potatoes and could not taste either. Mrs. Harlan's sister asked whether the lemon bars should be put out now or later, and I told her how. A little girl from the children's choir asked if she could have 2 pickles, and Linda, eyes still red, told her yes. Life, indecently enough, continued. But it continued in a different moral air. When I finally rose to go, Linda came to me with one covered dish in her hands. Chicken divan, judging by the label in her own writing on the lid. "For you," she said, "since your lunch mostly just sat there." I took it. Velma folded Evelyn's towel more neatly over my forearm as if correcting my draftsmanship on the gesture. She would have wanted the record true, she said, and then supper kept warm. That was so exactly Evelyn that I almost smiled through the ache. I carried the dish out through the side entrance, the blanket under my other arm, the towel over the first, and stepped into the bright, brittle cold of the parking lot. The winter sun sat low and white over the hedge line. The air smelled of leaf mold exhaust and distant chimney smoke. Somewhere behind me, the fellowship hall door opened and closed people moving on with the ordinary business of eating and carrying and cleaning up. That too was right. Justice had landed. The world did not need to freeze in admiration of it. Monday was for lawyers, not mine originally. Evelyn's cousin Margaret in Columbus had once handled a probate issue for us when my father died, and through her I was put in touch with a family attorney in our county named Helen Ruiz. 62, sharp-eyed widow herself, the sort of woman who reads a room the way some men read market reports. I went to her office with copies, first originals, second, and she did not once ask whether grief had made me obsessive. She asked better questions. What date appears on the passport application? Was the later adoption full and finalized? Did any record alter birth date or only usage across downstream documents? Did the biological father sign relinquishment or simply fail to pursue? Was there school reliance on the false date beyond passport use? Did the church create any representations in writing that can now be corrected? By the end of 45 minutes, I felt more human than I had in days, because competence in the presence of truth is a form of mercy all its own. Helen did not dramatize. She did not condemn. She said the altered usage trail was serious. The corrective process potentially messy but manageable, and the central principle very plain. A child's birth date is not a parental styling decision. She took the case. Rachel and Daniel came to her office the next afternoon. I was there. That was one of my conditions. No more private smoothing, no more explanatory caucuses from which I emerged later with the cleaned version. We sat in the same room and listened to the same sentences. Daniel had brought his folio. Rachel had brought a notebook but barely touched it. Helen walked them through the consequences in a voice calm enough to shame any attempt at melodrama. Corrective filings, potential review of supporting documents, clarifying affidavit, school update, passport correction, preservation of the original adoption order where valid but amendment of dependent identity records where false chronology had been inserted. Rachel cried once briefly when the phrase pattern of administrative misrepresentation was used. Helen handed her a tissue and went on. That too was part of justice. Compassion without vagueness. We never found Nathan Mercer. Or rather, Helen's investigator found enough to know he was living 3 states over working under inconsistent contractor licenses with 2 misdemeanor records and 1 dissolved support complaint from years back. There would be no heroic return, no showdown on my porch, no cinematic intrusion by the ghost of biology. The law was satisfied there had been abandonment enough and formal relinquishment matters already extinguished by time and the completed adoption. Rachel's terror, though not baseless in its origin, had long ago ceased to justify what she went on doing. I do not say that with triumph, only with clarity. The passport was corrected first. That took 3 weeks and more paper than any sane person would think possible for 1 wrong date. Owen came with us for the final identity verification appointment because Helen said he deserved to hear at least 1 government official state the truth plainly in his presence. The clerk, a patient woman with bifocals on a chain, said October the 3rd. There we are. Corrected in exactly the tone a person might use to straighten a crooked picture frame. I wanted to kiss her hand for it. The school was harder emotionally, though simpler administratively. Mrs. Brent, who had asked for the passport copy in the first place, looked mortified, and then overly kind. I cut off the kindness before it turned into the same old fog. This is a correction, I told her, not a tragedy. She nodded and handled it properly after that. The church archive was corrected on a Wednesday afternoon with only 4 of us in the little office, Velma, Linda, Rachel, and me. Velma removed the clean copy from the primary front sleeve and reattached the original notation beneath it with a typed amendment explaining the corrected chronology and archival rationale. No destruction, no tidying. A true record with a record of why it had once been softened. That to me mattered almost as much as the date itself. Lies like to disappear without leaving fingerprints. I wanted the fingerprints left. Rachel watched the whole thing with both hands clasped so tight in front of her that the knuckles showed white. She did not ask to speak. She did not soften. When Velma finished, Rachel said only, "I'm sorry." And because the apology was directed to no single person, it carried farther than a performance apology would have. Linda put the corrected file back in the drawer. The metal drawer slid shut with a plain office sound. I will remember the rest of my life. That was the sound of 1 piece of moral order returning to the world. Home took longer, not the house itself, the meaning of it. Rachel came once 2 weeks after the fellowship kitchen to return a casserole dish she could have sent through anyone else. She stood on my porch with the dish in both hands and no makeup on, looking older and younger at once. "I called first," she said. "I know. I used the doorbell. I noticed." That got the faintest shadow of a smile out of her, then it was gone. I let her in. She stood in the kitchen and looked around as if she had not been there in years, though it had been days. Maybe because she had never been there under clean light before. The back hall storage room door stood closed. The archive boxes were gone from the shelf because I had moved every one of them into the locked hall closet off my bedroom until I decided what belonged where. The house no longer offered casual access to family narrative tools. Rachel set the dish down by the sink and looked at the blanket which I had folded over the back of Evelyn's chair. "You left it there?" "Yes." She touched the chair, but not the blanket. "I hated it for a while." "I know. It looked like proof that Mom loved the messy version of us more than the one I built. I considered that. No, I said. It proves she loved you enough not to let the messy version get buried alive. Rachel cried again then, but quietly standing up this time, not asking me to gather her. I let her cry. We are taught as fathers to fix tears quickly if we can. Sometimes that is just another form of interruption. When she was done, she asked, "Do you think Owen will forgive me?" "I think children often do before they should," I said. "The real question is whether you'll live straight enough to deserve it." She nodded. There was no defense left in her, only work. Our bond did not mend neatly after that. How could it? There were Sundays she did not come. Sundays she came but sat farther down the table than before. Sundays when Owen ran to me the way he always had, and Rachel watched with that flinch mothers get when they know love has had to reroute around something they did. There were awkward calls with Helen. There were one or two ugly moments when Rachel accused me quietly of enjoying moral clarity too much now that I had finally found it. There were nights I lay awake wondering whether a father can reclaim truth without also in some secret place enjoying the authority it returns to him. That is part of the reason the ending is not neat. Truth is clean. The people who finally submit to it rarely are. What changed most quickly was Owen. Not because children are made of rubber and snap back from everything, though adults like to tell themselves that. Because the correction relieved a pressure he had not had words for. Once the right date settled into his school forms, his jokes, his class projects, his casual speech, a little carefulness went out of him. He stopped checking adults' faces after asking ordinary questions. He brought me a worksheet one Tuesday and said, "Write October 3rd in your handwriting too. Grandpa, I want all the old people to agree." I laughed then, real laughter, startled out of me. So we sat at my kitchen table. His worksheet between us, the smell of tomato soup on the stove, late sun angling in through the window, and I wrote October 3rd in my plain old Vam print beneath the date his teacher had already approved. He studied both versions with grave satisfaction and said, "Grandma's still nicer." "Yes," I said. "She usually is." The house changed in subtler ways. I relabeled the archive boxes in my own hand and moved them from the back hall to the study closet. Not hidden. Just no longer living among serving trays and event supplies. Memory was not a craft project anymore. It deserved a harder shelf. I changed the lock on the mudroom door a second time after discovering to my humiliation that I kept glancing toward it in the evening as if expecting unauthorized softness to enter. Helen said that was normal. She used the phrase after boundary shock, which sounded clinical and ridiculous enough that I liked it on sight. I brought the pantry back into order. That mattered more than I expected. One Saturday afternoon, I emptied the whole thing onto the counters. Flour, canned peaches, soup stock, old baking chocolate, plastic lids without dishes, dish without lids, masking tape, Sharpies, holiday spices. I threw away the dead tape and kept the meaningful labels in one envelope marked Evelyn's dates. Then I put the shelves back right. Not because order saves us. Because truthful order is one way a house stops feeling like a second voice. The biggest change came in prayer. For weeks after the confrontation, every time I bowed my head before meals, I found myself unable to say the old phrases the old way. Bless this food. Thank you for fellowship. Help us walk in peace. Peace had become a loaded word. Fellowship had learned bad habits. One night alone with a bowl of leftover stew and rain beginning on the windows, I finally said what I should have said sooner in life, and perhaps to more people than God. Lord, keep me from calling comfort righteousness. After that, prayer got easier. In December, just before Advent, Rachel and Owen came over to help put up the tree. Daniel had a work trip, which may have been convenient for all of us. He had not vanished from the family. That would be too easy and too false. He still came to church, still helped with chairs, still sat beside Rachel, but there was a chastening to him now I cannot describe without sounding unkind. Not humiliation exactly, more like a permanent awareness that steadiness is not the same thing as innocence. He treated me with a care that bordered on deference after the attorney meetings, and while some part of me enjoyed that more than I ought, another part grieved it. Fathers do not raise daughters so that the men beside them will someday stand in their kitchens, revealed and diminished. No matter what truth requires grief, stays attached to cost. That December afternoon, Rachel untangled lights on the floor, while Owen kept bringing me ornaments 2 at a time and asking which ones Grandma liked best. The house smelled of pine and dust from the ornament boxes and the sugar cookies Rachel had brought in a tin she kept opening and closing without eating from. At one point, she held up the old paper angel Owen made in kindergarten and said, "This one still says August." The room quieted. Then she crossed to the table, took out a pen, turned the ornament over, and wrote in small, neat letters, corrected October the 3rd, 2026. She did not make a speech. She did not look at me for approval. She just did it. That meant more to me than any apology she had made in the church office. Christmas itself was subdued. Better than the year after Evelyn died, harder than the year before the lie surfaced. Which was about right. Owen got a science kit, a model train set from Daniel and from me, a new leather-bound family Bible with a wide front page for births, marriages, and deaths. I saw Rachel notice the extra pages and the blank lines. She said nothing. After lunch, while the others were in the den arguing over batteries for the train controller, I opened the Bible to the family record page and set it on the kitchen table beside the blanket. Owen came in first. "What's that?" "Something your grandma used to keep up," I said. "Thought maybe we ought to again." He climbed into the chair beside me and looked at the lines. Births, baptisms, marriages, deaths. "Can I write mine?" he asked. "Not this one," I said. "Your spelling's still criminal." He grinned. I uncapped my pen. Evelyn's pen. The fountain pen I had carried to church in my pocket for years without really understanding why, and wrote slowly. Owen. Nathan Mercer Hale. Born October the 3rd. I stopped there. Nathan. The name had been discussed with lawyers, documented, not hidden anymore. Yet writing it into the family record cost me in a fresh way. Not because it honored the man, because it admitted the truth of the line without letting the fear around it keep running the house. Owen watched my face. "What's Nathan?" he asked. "It's part of your story," I said, "and stories don't get better when we cut pieces off." He thought about that. Then he nodded as if I had explained a mechanical principle rather than a family philosophy. Children are merciful that way. Rachel came into the kitchen while the ink was still drying. She saw the page, saw the date, saw the name, and stood very still. I did not turn away from it. Neither did she. After a moment, she crossed to the table and laid one hand on the back of Owen's chair. "That's right," she said quietly. It was the first time I had heard her say it without pain, trying to lead. There was no grand reconciliation, no scene where she fell against me sobbing that she finally understood. Real repair is less flattering than that. It is repetition. Straight answers, corrected forms, showing up when it costs you pride, not reaching for euphemism when the room gets tender. In late January, after one of the worst cold snaps of the winter, I got a call from Velma. "Don't forget the casserole dish," she said by way of greeting. "What casserole dish? The one you left in the church kitchen after the widow support luncheon. Blue flowers. Probably mine 10 years before it was yours. Come get it before somebody starts using it for every funeral bean salad in the county." So I drove over after dark. The church lot was nearly empty. Snow pushed up in gray ridges along the curbs. Inside the fellowship hall had been mostly cleaned, the smell of coffee and cream soup still lingering in the air. Velma had left the dish on the counter with a note taped to the lid in her hand. "Take home while true." I stood there and laughed softly to myself. Then I lifted the dish, folded Evelyn's towel over my arm out of pure habit, and went back through the side hall into the cold. The house was dark when I unlocked it. Not empty feeling. Waiting. I carried the dish into the kitchen and set it on the table. The blanket was already there, folded over the chair where it had lived most evenings since Christmas. Not displayed, not hidden, just present. The family Bible lay closed beside the fruit bowl. The pantry door stood shut. The back hall was quiet. The refrigerator hummed and then stopped. Somewhere in the walls, old heat pipes clicked as the furnace settled. I stood with my hand resting on the covered dish for a long moment. There are endings people like because they restore what was lost. This was not that kind. Evelyn was still dead. Rachel's lie had still happened. Owen had still learned too young that adults can alter the edges of your life and call it protection. Daniel would never again be merely the competent good man at church. And I would never get back the years I spent mistaking my wife's exactness for temperament instead of moral labor. What I had instead was smaller and more durable. One house speaking one honest story. I moved the dish a few inches so it sat beside the blanket rather than apart from it. The towel slid down my forearm, and I folded it once, then twice, the way Evelyn used to, before laying it by the stove for morning. The kitchen smelled faintly of roasted chicken, old wood beeswax, and the cold that still lived in the window glass. Warm lamplight touched the grain of the table and the edge of the blanket where the blue stitching hid inside the fold. I put my hand on that folded corner and stood there long enough to feel grief change shape one last time. Not leave. Not lessen, just breathe differently. Then I turned off the overhead light, left the small lamp on by the sink, and let the house hold the dish, the towel, the blanket, and the truth together in the same warm room.